An American Tragedy, continuing on cassette number 7, side 1. Up to this time, apart from the girls to whom he was so definitely drawn, Clyde was not so very favorably impressed with the type of girl who was working here. For the most part, as he saw them, they were of a heavy and rather unintelligent company, and he had been thinking that smarter-looking girls might possibly be secured. Why not? Were there none in Lycurgus in the factory world? So many of these had fat hands, broad faces, heavy legs and ankles. Some of them even spoke with an accent, being Poles, or the children of Poles, living in that slum north of the mill. And they were all concerned with catching a feller, going to some dancing places with him afterwards, and little more. Also, Clyde had noticed that the American types who were here were of a decidedly different texture, thinner, more nervous, and for the most part more angular, and with a general reserve due to prejudices, racial, moral, and religious, which would not permit them to mingle with these others or with any men apparently. But among the extras or tryouts that were brought to him during this and several succeeding days, finally came one who interested Clyde more than any girl whom he'd seen here so far. She was, as he decided on sight, more intelligent and pleasing, more spiritual, though apparently not less vigorous, if more gracefully proportioned. As a matter of fact, as he saw her at first, she appeared to him to possess a charm which no one else in this room had, a certain wistfulness and wonder combined with a kind of self-reliant courage and determination, which marked her at once as one possessed of will and conviction to a degree. Nevertheless, as she said, she was inexperienced in this kind of work, and highly uncertain as to whether she would prove of service here or anywhere. Her name was Roberta Alden, and as she had once explained, previous to this, she had been working in a small hosiery factory in a town called Trippett's Mills, 50 miles north of Lycurgus. She had on a small brown hat that did not look any too new, and was pulled low over a face that was small and regular and pretty, and was haloed by bright light brown hair. Her eyes were of a translucent grey blue. Her little suit was commonplace, and her shoes were not so very new-looking and quite solidly soled. She looked practical and serious, and yet so bright and clean and willing, and possessed of so much hope and vigour that, along with Liggett, who had first talked with her, he was at once taken with her. Distinctly she was above the average of the girls in this room, and he could not help wondering about her as he talked to her, for she seemed so tense, a little troubled as to the outcome of this interview, as though this was a very great adventure for her. She explained that up to this time she had been living with her parents near a town called Bouts, but was now living with friends here. She talked so honestly and simply that Clyde was very much moved by her, and for this reason wished to help her. At the same time he wondered if she were not really above the type of work she was seeking. Her eyes were so round and blue and intelligent, her lips and nose and ears and hands so small and pleasing. "You're going to live in Lycurgus, then, if you can get work here?" he said, more to be talking to her than anything else. "Yes," she said, looking at him most directly and frankly. "And the name again?" He took down a record pad. "Roberta Alden. And your address here?" 228 Taylor Street. "I don't even know where that is myself," he informed her, because he liked talking to her. "I haven't been here so very long, you see." He wondered just why afterwards he'd chosen to tell her as much about himself so swiftly. Then he added, "I don't know whether Mr. Liggett has told you all about the work here, but it's piecework, you know, stamping collars. I'll show you, if you'll just step over here." And he led the way to a nearby table where the stampers were. After letting her observe how it was done, and without calling Miss Todd, he picked up one of the collars and proceeded to explain all that had been previously explained to him. At the same time, because of the intentness with which she observed him and his gestures, the seriousness with which he appeared to take all that he said, he felt a little nervous and embarrassed. There was something quite searching and penetrating about her glance. After he had explained once more what the bundle rate was, and how much some made and how little others, and she had agreed that she would like to try, he called Miss Todd, who took her to the locker room to hang up her hat and coat. Then presently he saw her returning, a fluff of light hair about her forehead, her cheeks slightly flushed, her eyes very intent and serious. And as advised by Miss Todd, he saw her turn back her sleeves, revealing a pretty pair of forearms. Then she fell to, and by her gestures Clyde guessed that she would prove both speedy and accurate, for she seemed most anxious to obtain and keep this place. After she'd worked a little while, He went to her side and watched her as she picked up and stamped the collars piled beside her and threw them to one side. Also the speed and accuracy with which she did it. Then, because for a second she turned and looked at him, giving him an innocent and yet cheerful and courageous smile, he smiled back, most pleased. "Well, I guess she'll make out all right," he ventured to say, since he could not help feeling that she would. And instantly, for a second only, she turned and smiled again. And Clyde, in spite of himself, was quite thrilled. He liked her on the instant, but because of his own station here, of course, as he now decided, as well as his promise to Gilbert, he must be careful about being congenial with any of the help in this room. Even as charming a girl as this, it would not do. He'd been guarding himself in connection with the others, and must with her too, a thing which seemed a little strange to him then, for he was very much drawn to her. She was so pretty and cute. Yet she was a working girl, as he remembered now, too, a factory girl, as Gilbert would say, and he was her superior. But she was so pretty and cute. Instantly he went on to others who had been put on the same day, and finally, coming to Miss Todd, asked her to report pretty soon on how Miss Alden was getting along, that he wanted to know. But at the same time that he had addressed Roberta, and she smiled back at him, Rusa Nikiforovich, who was working 2 tables away, nudged the girl working next her, and without anyone noting it, first winked, then indicated with a slight movement of the head both Clyde and Roberta. Her friend was to watch them, and after Clyde had gone away and Roberta was working as before, she leaned over and whispered, "He says she'll do already." Then she lifted her eyebrows and compressed her lips, and her friend replied, so softly that no one could hear her, "Pretty quickly, and he didn't seem to see anyone else at all before." Then the twain smiled most wisely, a choice bit between them. Rusa Nikiforovich was jealous. Chapter 13. The reasons why a girl of Roberta's type should be seeking employment with Griffiths and Company at this time and in this capacity are of some point. For somewhat after the fashion of Clyde in relation to his family and his life, she too considered her life a great disappointment. She was the daughter of Titus Alden, a farmer, of near Bouts, a small town in Menial County, some 50 miles north, and from her youth up she'd seen little but poverty. Her father, the youngest of 3 sons of Ephraim Alden, a farmer in this region before him, was so unsuccessful that at 48 he was still living in a house which, though old and much in need of repair at the time his father willed it to him, was now bordering upon a state of dilapidation. The house itself, while primarily a charming example of that excellent taste which produced those delightful gabled homes which embellish the average New England town and street, had been by now so reduced for want of paint, shingles, and certain flags, which had once made a winding walk from a road gate to the front door, that it presented a decidedly melancholy aspect to the world, as though it might be coughing and saying, "Well, things are none too satisfactory with me." The interior of the house corresponded with the exterior. The floorboards and stairboards were loose and creaked most eerily at times. Some of the windows had shades, some did not. Furniture of both an earlier and a later date, but all in somewhat decayed condition, intermingled and furnished it in some nondescript manner which need hardly be described. As for the parents of Roberta, they were excellent examples of that native type of Americanism which resists facts and reveres illusion. Titus Alden was one of that vast company of individuals who were born, pass through, and die out of the world without ever quite getting any one thing straight. They appear, blunder, and end in a fog. Like his 2 brothers, both older and almost as nebulous, Titus was a farmer solely because his father had been a farmer, and he was here on this farm because it had been willed to him, and because it was easier to stay here and try to work this than it was to go elsewhere. He was a Republican because his father before him was a Republican, and because this county was Republican. It never occurred to him to be otherwise, and as in the case of his politics and his religion, he'd borrowed all his notions of what was right and wrong from those about him. A single serious, intelligent, or rightly informing book had never even been read by any member of this family, not one. But they were nevertheless excellent as conventions, morals, and religions go, honest, upright, God-fearing, and respectable. In so far as the daughter of these parents was concerned, and in the face of natural gifts which fitted her for something better than this world from which she derived, she was still, in part at least, a reflection of the religious and moral notions there and then prevailing. and the views of the local ministers and the laity in general. At the same time, because of a warm, imaginative, sensuous temperament, she was filled, once she reached age 15 and 16, with the world-old dream of all of Eve's daughters, from the homeliest to the fairest, that her beauty or charm might some day and ere long smite bewitchingly and so irresistibly the soul of a given man or men. So it was that although throughout her infancy and girlhood she was compelled to hear of and share a depriving and toilsome poverty, still, because of her innate imagination, she was always thinking of something better. Maybe some day, who knew, a larger city like Albany or Utica, a newer and greater life. And then what dreams! And in the orchard of the spring day later, between her 14th and 18th years, when the early May sun was making pink lamps of every aged tree, and the ground was pinkly carpeted with the falling and odorous petals, she would stand and breathe and sometimes laugh or even sigh, her arms upreached or thrown wide to life, to be alive, to have youth and the world before one, to think of the eyes and the smile of some youth of the region who by the merest chance had passed her and looked, and who might never look again, but who nevertheless in so doing had stirred her young soul to dreams. None the less she was shy and hence recessive, afraid of men, especially the more ordinary types common to this region, and these in turn, repulsed by her shyness and refinement, tended to recede from her, for all of her physical charm, which was too delicate for this region. Nevertheless, at the age of 16, having repaired to Bouts in order to work in Appleman's dry goods store for $5 a week, she saw many young men who attracted her. But here, because of her mood in regard to her family's position, as well as the fact that to her inexperienced eyes they appeared so much better placed than herself, she was convinced that they would not be interested in her. And here again it was her own mood that succeeded in alienating them almost completely. Nevertheless, she remained working for Mr. Appleman until she was between 18 and 19, all the while sensing that she was really doing nothing for herself, because she was too closely identified with her home and her family, who appeared to need her. And then about this time, an almost revolutionary thing for this part of the world occurred, for because of the cheapness of labor in such an extremely rural section, a small hosiery plant was built at Griffiths Mills, and though Roberta, because of the views and standards that prevailed hereabout, had somehow conceived of this type of work as beneath her, still she was fascinated by the reports of high wages to be paid. Accordingly, she repaired to Griffiths Mills, where, boarding at the house of a neighbor who had previously lived in Bouts, and returning home every Saturday afternoon, she planned to bring together the means for some further form of practical education, a course at a business college at Homer or Lycurgus, or somewhere which might fit her for something better, bookkeeping or stenography. And in connection with this dream and this attempted saving, 2 years went by, and in the meanwhile, although she earned more money, eventually $12 a week, still, because various members of her family required so many little things, and she desired to alleviate to a degree the privations of these others from which she suffered, nearly all that she earned went to them. And again, here, as at Bouts, most of the youths of the town who were better suited to her intellectually and temperamentally still looked upon the mere factory type as beneath them in many ways, and although Roberta was far from being that type, still, having associated herself with them, she was inclined to absorb some of their psychology in regard to themselves. Indeed, by then she was fairly well satisfied that not one of these here in whom she was interested would be interested in her, at least not with any legitimate intentions. And then 2 things occurred which caused her to think, not only seriously of marriage, but of her own future, whether she married or not. For her sister Agnes, now 20 and 3 years her junior, having recently re-encountered a young schoolmaster who some time before had conducted the district school near the Alden farm, and finding him more to her taste now than when she'd been in school, had decided to marry him. And this meant, as Roberta saw it, that she was about to take on the appearance of a spinster unless she married soon. Yet she did not quite see what was to be done until the hosiery factory at Griffiths Mill suddenly closed, never to reopen. And then, in order to assist her mother as well as help with her sister's wedding, she returned to Bouts. But then there came a third thing which decidedly affected her dreams and plans. Grace Marr, a girl whom she had met at Griffiths Mills, had gone to Lycurgus, and after a few weeks there had managed to connect herself with a Finchley Vacuum Cleaner Company at a salary of $15 a week, and at once wrote to Roberta telling her of the opportunities that were then present in Lycurgus. For in passing the Griffiths company, which she did daily, she'd seen a large sign posted over the East employment door reading, "Girls Wanted." An inquiry revealed the fact that girls at this company were always started at $9 or $10, quickly taught some of the various phases of piecework, and then, once they were proficient, were frequently able to earn as much as from $14 to $16 according to their skill. And since board and room were only consuming 7 of what she earned, she was delighted to communicate to Roberta, whom she liked very much, that she might come and room with her if she wished. Roberta, having reached the place where she felt that she could no longer endure farm life, but must act for herself once more, finally arranged with her mother to leave in order that she might help her more directly with her wages. But once in Lycurgus and employed by Clyde, her life, after the first flush of self-interest, which a change so greatly implied for her, was not so much enlarged socially or materially either, for that matter, over what it had been in Bill's and Trippett's mills. For despite the genial intimacy of Grace Marr, a girl not nearly as attractive as Roberta, and who, because of Roberta's charm and for the most part affected gaiety, counted on her to provide a cheer and companionship which otherwise she would have lacked, still the world into which she was inducted here was scarcely any more liberal or diversified than that from which she sprang. For to begin with, the Newtons, sister and brother-in-law of Grace Marr, with whom she lived, and who, despite the fact that they were not unkindly, proved to be almost more so than they were the types with whom, either in Bill's or Trippett's mills, she'd been in constant contact, the most ordinary small-town mill-workers, religious and narrow to a degree. George Newton, as everyone could see and feel, was a pleasant, if not very emotional or romantic person, who took his various small plans in regard to himself and his future as of the utmost importance. Primarily, he was saving what little cash he could out of the wages he earned as threadman in the Cranston wickwire factory to enable him to embark upon some business for which he thought himself fitted. And to this end, and to further enhance his meagre savings, he joined with his wife in the scheme of taking over an old house in Taylor Street, which permitted the renting of enough rooms to carry the rent, and in addition to supply the food for the family and 5 boarders, counting their labor and worries in the process as nothing. And on the other hand, Grace Marr, as well as Newton's wife Mary, were of that type that here as elsewhere find the bulk of their social satisfaction in such matters as relate to the organization of a small home, the establishing of its import and integrity in a petty and highly conventional neighborhood, and the contemplation of life and conduct through the lens furnished by a purely sectarian creed. And so, once part and parcel of this particular household, Roberta found after a time that it, if not Lycurgus, was narrow and restricted, not wholly unlike the various narrow and restricted homes at Bill's, and these lines, according to the Newtons and the like, to be strictly observed. No good could come of breaking them. If you were a factory employee, you should accommodate yourself to the world and customs of the better sort of Christian factory employees. Every day, therefore, and that not so very long after she'd arrived, she found herself up and making the best of a not very satisfactory breakfast in the Newton dining-room, which was usually shared by Grace and 2 other girls of nearly their own age, Opal Fellis and Olive Pope, who were connected with the Cranston Wickwire Company, also by a young electrician by the name of Fred Sherlock, who worked for the city lighting plant, and immediately after breakfast joining a long procession that day after day at this hour made for the mills across the river, for just outside her own door she invariably met with a company of factory girls and women, boys and men of the same relative ages, to say nothing of many old and weary-looking women who looked more like wraiths than human beings, who'd issued from the various streets and houses of this vicinity. And as the crowd, because of the general inpour into it from various streets, thickened at Central Avenue, there was much ogling of the prettier girls by a certain type of factory man, who, not knowing any of them, still saw it as Roberta saw it, unlicensed contacts, and even worse. Yet there was much giggling and simpering on the part of girls of a certain type, who were by no means as severe as most of those she'd known elsewhere. Shocking! And at night the same throng, reforming at the mills, crossing the bridge at the depot, and returning as it had come. And Roberta, because of her social and moral training and mood, and in spite of her decided looks and charm and strong desires, feeling alone and neglected. Oh, how sad to see the world so gay and she so lonely. and it was always after 6 when she reached home, and after dinner there was really nothing much of anything to do, unless she and Grace attended one or another of the moving picture theaters, or she could bring herself to consent to join the Newtons and Grace at a meeting at the Methodist Church. Nonetheless, once part and parcel of this household and working for Clyde, she was delighted with the change. This big city, this fine Central Avenue with its stores and moving picture theaters, these great mills, and again this Mr. Griffiths, so young, attractive, smiling, and interested in her. Chapter 14. In the same way Clyde, on encountering her, was greatly stirred. Since the abortive contact with Dillard, Rita, and Zella, and afterwards the seemingly meaningless invitation to the Griffiths with its introduction to and yet only passing glimpse of such personages as Bella, Sandra Finchley, and Bertine Cranston, he was lonely indeed. That high world. But plainly he was not to be allowed to share in it. And yet, because of his vain hope in connection with it, he had chosen to cut himself off in this way. And to what end? Was he not, if anything, more lonely than ever? Mrs. Peyton, going to and from his work, but merely nodding to people or talking casually, or however sociably with one or another of the storekeepers along Central Avenue who chose to hail him, or even some of the factory girls here in whom he was not interested, or with whom he did not dare to develop a friendship. What was that? Just nothing, really. And yet, as an offset to all this, of course, was he not a Griffiths, and so entitled to their respect and reverence even on this account? What a situation, really! What to do? And at the same time, this Roberta Alden, once she was placed here in this fashion, and becoming more familiar with local conditions, as well as the standing of Clyde, his charm, his evasive and yet sensible interest in her, was becoming troubled as to her state, too. For once part and parcel of this local home she joined, she was becoming conscious of various local taboos and restrictions, which made it seem likely that never at any time here would it be possible to express an interest in Clyde or anyone above her officially. There was a local taboo in regard to factory girls aspiring toward or allowing themselves to become interested in their official superiors. Religious, moral, and reserved girls didn't do it. And again, as she soon discovered, the lines of demarcation and stratification between the rich and the poor in Lycurgus was as sharp as though cut by a knife, or divided by a high wall. And another taboo in regard to all the foreign family girls and men, ignorant, low, immoral, un-American. One should above all have nothing to do with them. But among these people, as she could see, the religious and moral, lower middle-class group, to which she and all of her intimates belonged, dancing or local adventurous gaiety, such as walking the streets or going to a moving picture theater, was also taboo. And yet she herself at this time was becoming interested in dancing. Worse than this, the various young men and girls of the particular church which she and Grace Marr attended at first were not inclined to see Roberta or Grace as equals, since they, for the most part, were members of older and more successful families of the town. And so it was that after a very few weeks of attendance of church affairs and services, they were about where they'd been when they started, conventional and acceptable, but without the amount of entertainment and diversion which was normally reaching those who were of their same church but better placed. And so it was that Roberta, after encountering Clyde and sensing the superior world in which he imagined he moved, and being so taken with the charm of his personality, was seized with the very virus of ambition and unrest that afflicted him. And every day that she went to the factory now, she could not help but feel that his eyes were upon her in a quiet, seeking, and yet doubtful way. Yet she also felt that he was too uncertain as to what she would think of any overture that he might make in her direction to risk a repulse or any offensive interpretation on her part. And yet at times, after the first 2 weeks of her stay here, she wishing that he would speak to her, that he would make some beginning, at other times that he must not dare, that it would be dreadful and impossible. The other girls there would see at once, and since they all plainly felt that he was too good or too remote for them, they would at once note that he was making an exception in her case, and would put their own interpretation on it. And she knew the type of a girl who worked in the Griffiths stamping room would put but one interpretation on it, that of looseness. At the same time, insofar as Clyde and his leaning toward her was concerned, there was that rule laid down by Gilbert, and although because of it he had hitherto appeared not to notice, or to give any more attention to one girl than another. Still, once Roberta arrived, he was almost unconsciously inclined to drift by her table and pause in her vicinity to see how she was progressing. And as he saw from the first, she was a quick and intelligent worker, soon mastering, without much advice of any kind, all the tricks of the work, and thereafter earning about as much as any of the others, $15 a week. And her manner was always that of one who enjoyed it, and was happy to have the privilege of working here, and pleased to have him pay any little attention to her. At the same time he noticed, to his surprise, and especially since to him she seemed so refined and different, a certain exuberance and gaiety that was not only emotional, but in a delicate, poetic way, sensual. Also that despite her difference and reserve, she was able to make friends with and seemed to be able to understand the viewpoint of most of the foreign girls who were essentially so different from her. For listening to her discuss the work here, first with Lena Schlicht, Oda Petkanis, Angelina Pitti, and some others who soon chose to speak to her, he reached the conclusion that she was not nearly so conventional or standoffish as most of the other American girls, and yet she did not appear to lose their respect either. Thus one noontime, coming back from the office lunch downstairs a little earlier than usual, he found her and several of the foreign family girls, as well as 4 of the American girls, surrounding Polish Mary, one of the gayest and roughest of the foreign family girls, who was explaining in rather a high key how a certain feller whom she met the night before had given her a beaded bag, and for what purpose. "I should go with him to be his sweetheart," she announced with a flourish, the while she waved the bag before the interested group. "And I say, I take him and think on him. Pretty nice bag, eh?" she added, holding it aloft and turning it about. "Tell me," she added, with provoking, and yet probably only mock-serious eyes, and waving the bag toward Roberta, "what shall I do with him? Keep him and go with him to be his sweetheart, or give him back? I like him pretty much, that bag, you bet." And although, according to the laws of her upbringing, as Clyde suspected, Roberta should have been shocked by all this, she was not, as he noticed, far from it. If one might have judged from her face, she was very much amused. Instantly she replied with a gay smile, "Well, it all depends on how handsome he is, Mary. If he's very attractive, I think I'd string him along for a while anyhow, and keep the bag as long as I could." "Oh, but he no wait," declared Mary archly, and with plainly a keen sense of the riskiness of the situation, the while she winked at Clyde, who drew near. "I got to give him bag, or be sweetheart tonight, and so swell bag I can never buy myself." She eyed the bag archly and roguishly, her own nose crinkling with the humor of the situation. "What I do then?" "Gee, this is pretty strong stuff for a little country girl like Miss Holden. She won't like this, maybe," thought Clyde to himself. However, Roberta, as he now saw, appeared to be equal to the situation, for she pretended to be troubled. "Gee, you are in a fix," she commented. "I don't know what you'll do now." She opened her eyes wide and pretended to be greatly concerned. However, as Clyde could see, she was merely acting, but carrying it off very well. And frizzle-haired Dutch Lena now leaned forward to say, "I take it and him too, you bet, if you don't want him. Where is he? I got no feller now." She reached over as if to take the bag from Mary, who as quickly withdrew it, and there were squeals of delight from nearly all the girls in the room, who were amused by this eccentric horseplay. Even Roberta laughed loudly, a fact which Clyde noted with pleasure, for he liked all this rough humor, considering it mere innocent play. "Well, maybe you're right, Lena," he heard her add just as the whistle blew, and the hundreds of sewing machines in the next room began to hum. "A good man isn't to be found every day." Her blue eyes were twinkling, and her lips, which were most temptingly modeled, were parted in a broad smile. There was much banter and more bluff in what she said than anything else, as Clyde could see, but he felt that she was not nearly as narrow as he'd feared. She was human and gay and tolerant and good-natured. There was decidedly a very liberal measure of play in her, and in spite of the fact that her clothes were poor, the same little round brown hat and blue cloth dress that she'd worn on first coming to work here, she was prettier than anyone else, and she never needed to paint her lips and cheeks like the foreign girls, whose faces at times looked like pink frosted cakes. And how pretty were her arms and neck, plump and gracefully designed, and there was a certain grace and abandon about her as she threw herself into her work as though she really enjoyed it. As she worked fast during the hottest portions of the day, there would gather on her upper lip and chin and forehead little beads of perspiration, which she was always pausing in her work to touch with her handkerchief, while to him, like jewels, they seemed only to enhance her charm. Wonderful days these now for Clyde, for once more, and here where he could be nearer the long day through, he had a girl whom he could study and admire, and by degrees proceed to crave with all of the desire of which he seemed to be capable, and with which he had craved Hortense Briggs, only with more satisfaction, since, as he saw it, she was simpler, more kindly, and respectable. And though for quite a while at first Roberta appeared or pretended to be quite indifferent to or unconscious of him, still from the very first this was not true. She was only troubled as to the appropriate attitude for her, the beauty of his face and hands, the blackness and softness of his hair, the darkness and melancholy and lure of his eyes. He was attractive, oh, very, beautiful really to her. And then one day shortly thereafter, Gilbert Griffiths walking through here and stopping to talk to Clyde, she was led to imagine by this that Clyde was really much more of a figure socially and financially than she previously thought. But just as Gilbert was approaching, Lena Schlicht, who was working beside her, leaned over to say, "Here comes Mr. Gilbert Griffiths. His father owns this whole factory, and when he dies he'll get it, they say. And he's his cousin," she added, nodding toward Clyde. "They look a lot alike, don't they?" "Yes, they do," replied Roberta, slyly studying not only Clyde but Gilbert. "Only I think Mr. Clyde Griffiths is a little nicer looking, don't you?" Oda Petkanas, sitting on the other side of Roberta and overhearing this last remark, laughed. "That's what everyone here thinks. He's not stuck up like that Mr. Gilbert Griffiths either." "Is he rich, too?" inquired Roberta, thinking of Clyde. "I don't know. They say not." She pursed her lips dubiously, herself rather interested in Clyde along with the others. "He worked down in the shrinking room before he came up here. He was just working by the day, I guess. But he only came on here a little while ago to learn the business. Maybe he won't work here much longer." Roberta was suddenly troubled by this last remark. She'd not been thinking, or so she'd been trying to tell herself, of Clyde in any romantic way, and yet the thought that he might suddenly go at any moment, never to be seen by her any more, disturbed her now. He was so youthful, so brisk, so attractive, and so interested in her, too. Yes, that was plain. It was wrong to think that he would be interested in her, or to try to attract him by any least gesture of hers, since he was so important a person here, far above her. For true to her complex, the moment she heard that Clyde was so highly connected, and might even have money, she was not so sure that he could have any legitimate interest in her. For was she not a poor working girl, and was he not a very rich man's nephew? He would not marry her, of course, and what other legitimate thing would he want with her? She must be on her guard in regard to him. Chapter 15. The thoughts of Clyde at this time in regard to Roberta and his general situation in Lycurgus were for the most part confused and disturbing, for had not Gilbert warned him against associating with a help here? On the other hand, in so far as his actual daily life was concerned, his condition was socially the same as before, apart from the fact that his move to Mrs. Peyton's had taken him into a better street and neighborhood. He was really not so well off as he'd been at Mrs. Cuppy's, for there at least he'd been in touch with those young people who'd been diverting enough had he felt that he would have been wise to indulge them. But now, aside from a bachelor brother who was old as Mrs. Peyton herself, and a son 30, slim and reserved, who was connected with one of the Lycurgus banks, he saw no one who could or would trouble to entertain him. Like the others with whom he came in contact, they thought him possessed of relationships which would make it unnecessary and even a bit presumptuous for them to suggest ways and means of entertaining him. On the other hand, while Roberta was not of that high world to which he now aspired, still there was that about her which enticed him beyond measure. Day after day, and because so much alone, and furthermore because of so strong a chemic or temperamental pull that was so definitely asserting itself, he could no longer keep his eyes off her, or she hers from him. There were evasive and yet strained and feverish eye-flashes between them, and after one such in his case, a quick and furtive glance on her part at times, by no means intended to be seen by him, he found himself weak and then feverish. Her pretty mouth, her lovely big eyes, her radiant and yet so often shy and evasive smile. And oh, she had such pretty arms, Such a trim, lithe, sentient, quick figure and movements. If he only dared be friendly with her, venture to talk with her and then see her somewhere afterwards. If she only would, and if he only dared. Confusion, aspiration, hours of burning and yearning, for indeed he was not only puzzled but irritated by the anomalous and paradoxical contrasts which his life here presented, loneliness and wistfulness, as against the fact that it was being generally assumed by such as knew him that he was rather pleasantly and interestingly employed socially. Therefore, in order to enjoy himself in some way befitting his present rank, and to keep out of the sight of those who were imagining that he was being so much more handsomely entertained than he was, he'd been more recently, on Saturday afternoons and Sundays, making idle sightseeing trips to Gloversville, Fonda, Amsterdam, and other places, as well as Grey and Crum Lakes, where there were boats, beaches, and bathhouses, with bathing suits for rent. And there, because he was always thinking that if by chance he should be taken up by the Griffiths, he would need as many social accomplishments as possible, and by reason of encountering a man who took a fancy to him and who could both swim and dive, he learned to do both exceedingly well. But canoeing fascinated him really. He was pleased by the picturesque and summery appearance he made in an outing shirt and canvas shoes, paddling about Crum Lake in one of the bright red or green or blue canoes that were leased by the hour. And at such times these summer scenes appeared to possess an airy, fairy quality, especially with a summer cloud or two hanging high above in the blue. And so his mind indulged itself in daydreams as to how it would feel to be a member of one of the wealthy groups that frequented the more noted resorts of the North, Racket Lake, Shroon Lake, Lake George, and Champlain, dance, golf, tennis, canoe, with those who could afford to go to such places, the rich of Lycurgus. And it was about this time that Roberta, with her friend Grace, found Crum Lake, and had decided on it, with the approval of Mr. and Mrs. Newton, as one of the best and most reserved of all the smaller watering places about here. And so it was that they, too, were already given to riding out to the pavilion on a Saturday or Sunday afternoon, and once there, following the west shore, along which ran a well-worn footpath which led to clumps of trees, underneath which they sat and looked at the water, for neither could row a boat or swim. Also there were wildflowers and berry bushes to be plundered, and from certain marshy spots, to be reached by venturing out for a score of feet or more, it was possible to reach and take white lilies with their delicate yellow hearts. They were decidedly tempting, and on 2 occasions already the marauders had brought Mrs. Newton large armfuls of blooms from the fields and shoreline here. On the 3rd Sunday afternoon in July, Clyde, as lonely and rebellious as ever, was paddling about in a dark blue canoe along the south bank of the lake, about 1.5 miles from the boathouse. His coat and hat were off, and in a seeking and half-resentful mood he was imagining vain things in regard to the type of life he would really like to lead. At different points on the lake in canoes, or their more clumsy companions, the rowboats, were boys and girls, men and women, and over the water occasionally would come their laughter or bits of their conversation, and in the distance would be other canoes and other dreamers, happily in love, as Clyde invariably decided, that being to him the sharpest contrast to his own lorn state. At any rate, the sight of any other youth thus romantically engaged with his girl was sufficient to set dissonantly jangling the repressed and protesting libido of his nature, and this would cause his mind to paint another picture in which, had fortune favored him in the first place by birth, he would now be in some canoe on Shroon or Racket or Champlain Lake, with Sandra Finchley or some such girl, paddling and looking at the shores of a scene more distingué than this. Or might he not be riding or playing tennis, or in the evening dancing or racing from place to place in some high-powered car, Sandra by his side? He felt so out of it, so lonely and restless and tortured by all that he saw here, for everywhere that he looked he seemed to see love, romance, contentment. What to do? Where to go? He could not go on alone like this forever. He was too miserable. In memory as well as mood, his mind went back to the few gay, happy days he had enjoyed in Kansas City before that dreadful accident. Ratterer, Hegland, Higby, Tina Kogel, Hortense, Ratterer's sister Louise. In short, the gay company of which he was just beginning to be a part when that terrible accident had occurred. And next to Dillard, Rita, Zella, a companionship that would have been better than this, certainly. Were the Griffiths never to do any more for him than this? Had he only come here to be sneered at by his cousin, pushed aside? or rather completely ignored by all the bright company of which the children of his rich uncle were a part. And so plainly, from so many interesting incidents, even now in this dead summertime, he could see how privileged and relaxed and apparently decidedly happy were those of that circle. Notices in the local papers almost every day as to their coming and going here and there. The large and expensive cars of Samuel, as well as Gilbert Griffiths, parked outside the main office entrance on such days as they were in Lycurgus, an occasional group of young society figures to be seen before the grill of the Lycurgus Hotel, or before one of the fine homes in Waikiki Avenue, someone having returned to the city for an hour or a night. And in the factory itself, whenever either was there, Gilbert or Samuel, in the smartest of summer clothes and attended by either Messrs. Smiley, Latch, Gotboy, or Berkey, all high officials of the company, making a most austere and even regal round of the immense plant, and consulting with or listening to the reports of the various minor department heads. And yet here was he, a full cousin to the same Gilbert, a nephew to this distinguished Samuel, being left to drift and pine by himself, and for no other reason than, as he could now clearly see, he was not good enough. His father was not as able as this, his great uncle. His mother, might heaven keep her, not as distinguished or as experienced as his cold, superior, indifferent aunt. Might it not be best to leave? Had he not made a foolish move, after all, in coming on here? What, if anything, did these high relatives ever intend to do for him? In loneliness and resentment and disappointment, his mind now wandered from the Griffiths and their world, and particularly that beautiful Sandra Finchley, whom he recalled with a keen and biting thrill, to Roberta, and the world which she as well as he was occupying here. For although a poor factory girl, she was still so much more attractive than any of these other girls with whom he was every day in contact. How unfair and ridiculous for the Griffiths to insist that a man in his position should not associate with a girl such as Roberta, for instance, and just because she worked in the mill, he might not even make friends with her and bring her to some such lake as this, or visit her in her little home on account of that. And yet he could not go with others more worthy of him, perhaps for lack of means or contacts. And besides, she was so attractive, very, and especially enticing to him. He could see her now as she worked with her swift, graceful movements at her machine, her shapely arms and hands, her smooth skin and her bright eyes as she smiled up at him. And his thoughts were played over by exactly the same emotions that swept him so regularly at the factory. For poor or not, a working girl by misfortune only, he could see how he could be very happy with her, if only he did not need to marry her. For now his ambitions toward marriage had been firmly magnetized by the world to which the Griffiths belonged, and yet his desires were most colorfully inflamed by her. If only he might venture to talk to her more, to walk home with her some day from the mill, to bring her out here to this lake on a Saturday or Sunday and row about, just to idle and dream with her. He rounded a point studded with a clump of trees and bushes, and covering a shallow where were scores of water lilies afloat, their large leaves resting flat upon the still water of the lake. And on the bank to the left was a girl standing and looking at them. She had her hat off and one hand to her eyes, for she was facing the sun, and was looking down in the water. Her lips were parted in careless inquiry. She was very pretty, he thought, as he paused in his paddling to look at her. The sleeves of a pale blue waist came only to her elbows, and a darker blue skirt of flannel reconveyed to him the trimness of her figure. It wasn't Roberta. It couldn't be. Yes, it was. Almost before he'd decided, he was quite beside her, some 20 feet from the shore, and was looking up at her, his face lit by the radiance of one who had suddenly, and beyond his belief, realized a dream. And as though he were a pleasant apparition suddenly evoked out of nothing and nowhere, a poetic effort taking form out of smoke or vibrant energy, she in turn stood staring down at him, her lips unable to resist the wavy line of beauty that a happy mood always brought to them. "My, Miss Alden! It's you, isn't it?" he called. "I was wondering whether it was. I couldn't be sure from out here." "Why, yes, it is," she laughed, puzzled and again just the least bit abashed by the reality of it. For in spite of her obvious pleasure at seeing him again, only thinly repressed for the first moment or two, she was on the instant beginning to be troubled by her thoughts in regard to him, the difficulties that contact with him seemed to prognosticate. For this meant contact and friendship, maybe, and she was no longer in any mood to resist him, whatever people might think. And yet here was her friend Grace Marr. What she wanted to know of Clyde and her interest in him. She was troubled, and yet she could not resist smiling and looking at him in a frank and welcoming way. She'd been thinking of him so much, and wishing for him in some happy, secure, commendable way, and now here he was, and there could be nothing more innocent than his presence here, nor hers. "Just out for a walk," he forced himself to say, although because of his delight and his fear of her really, he felt not a little embarrassed now that she was directly before him. At the same time he added, recalling that she'd been looking so intently at the water, "You want some of these water lilies? Is that what you're looking for?" "Uh-huh," she replied, still smiling and looking directly at him, for the side of his dark hair blown by the wind, the pale blue outing shirt he wore open at the neck, his sleeves rolled up, and the yellow paddle, held by him above the handsome blue boat, quite thrilled her. If only she could win such a youth for her very own self, just hers and no one else's in the whole world. It seemed as though this would be paradise, that if she could have him she would never want anything else in all the world. And here at her very feet he sat now in this bright canoe, on this clear July afternoon in this summery world, so new and pleasing to her. And now he was laughing up at her so directly and admiringly. Her girlfriend was far in the rear somewhere looking for daisies. Could she? Should she? "I was seeing if there was any way to get out to any of them," she continued, a little nervously, a tremor almost revealing itself in her voice. "I haven't seen any before just here on this side." "I'll get you all you want," he exclaimed briskly and gaily. "You just stay where you are. I'll bring them." But then, bethinking him of how much more lovely it would be if she were to get in with him, he added, "But see here, why don't you get in here with me? There's plenty of room, and I can take you anywhere you want to go. There's lots nicer lilies up the lake here a little way, and on the other side, too. I saw hundreds of them over there just beyond that island." Roberta looked, and as she did, another canoe paddled by, holding a youth of about Clyde's years and a girl no older than herself. She wore a white dress and a pink hat, and the canoe was green. And far across the water at the point of the very island about which Clyde was talking was another canoe, bright yellow, with a boy and girl in that. She was thinking she would like to get in without her companion if possible, with her if need be. She wanted so much to have him all to herself. If she'd only come out here alone. For if Grace Marr were included, she would know and later talk maybe, or think if she'd heard anything else in regard to them ever. And yet if she did not, there was the fear that he might not like her any more, might even come to dislike her or give up being interested in her, and that would be dreadful. She stood staring and thinking, and Clyde, troubled and pained by her doubt on this occasion and his own loneliness and desire for her, suddenly called, "Oh, please don't say no. Just get in, won't you? You'll like it. I want you to." And cassette number 7, side 1. To continue, please turn the cassette over. Cassette number 7, side 2 of An American Tragedy. Clyde continued, "We can find all the lilies you want. I can let you out anywhere you want to get out, in 10 minutes if you want to." She marked the "I want you to." It soothed and strengthened her. He had no desire to take any advantage of her, as she could see. "But I have my friend with me here," she exclaimed, almost sadly and dubiously, for she still wanted to go alone. Never in her life had she wanted anyone less than Grace Marr at this moment. Why had she brought her? She wasn't so very pretty, and Clyde might not like her, and that might spoil the occasion. "Besides," she added almost in the same breath, and with many thoughts fighting her, "maybe I'd better not. Is it safe?" "Oh, yes, maybe you better had," laughed Clyde, seeing that she was yielding. "It's perfectly safe," he added eagerly. Then, maneuvering the canoe next to the bank, which was a foot above the water, and laying hold of a root to hold it still, he said, "Of course you won't be in any danger. Call your friend then if you want to, and I'll row the 2 of you. There's room for 2, and there's lots of water lilies everywhere over there." He nodded toward the east side of the lake. Roberta could no longer resist, and seized an overhanging branch by which to steady herself. At the same time she began to call, "Oh, Grace! Grace! Where are you?" For she at last decided that it was best to include her. A far-off voice as quickly answered, "Hello, what do you want?" "Come up here, come on. I got something I want to tell you." "Oh, no, you come on down here. The daisies are just wonderful." "No, you come on up here. There's someone here that wants to take us boating." She intended to call this loudly, but somehow her voice failed, and her friend went on gathering flowers. Roberta frowned. She did not know just what to do. "Oh, very well, then," she suddenly decided, and straightening up added, "We can row down to where she is, I guess." And Clyde, delighted, exclaimed, "Oh, that's just fine. Sure. Do get in. We'll pick these here first, and then if she hasn't come, I'll paddle down nearer to where she is. Just step square in the center, and that will balance it." He was leaning back and looking up at her, and Roberta was looking nervously and yet warmly into his eyes. Actually, it was as though she was suddenly diffused with joy, enveloped in a rosy mist. She balanced one foot. "Will it be perfectly safe?" "Sure, sure," emphasized Clyde. "I'll hold it safe. Just take hold of that branch there and steady yourself by that." He held the boat very still as she stepped. Then, as the canoe careened slightly to one side, she dropped to the cushioned seat with a little cry. It was like that of a baby to Clyde. "It's all right," he reassured her. "Just sit in the center there. It won't tip over. Gee, but this is funny. I can't make it out quite. You know, just as I was coming around that point, I was thinking of you. Maybe you might like to come out to a place like this sometime. And now here you are, and here I am, and it all happened just like that." He waved his hand and snapped his fingers. And Roberta, fascinated by this confession, and yet a little frightened by it, added, "Is that so?" She was thinking of her own thoughts in regard to him. "Yes, and what's more," added Clyde, "I've been thinking of you all day, really. That's the truth. I was wishing I might see you somewhere this morning and bring you out here." "Oh, now, Mr. Griffiths, you know you don't mean that," pleaded Roberta, fearful lest this sudden contact should take too intimate and sentimental a turn too quickly. She scarcely liked that because she was afraid of him and herself, and now she looked at him, trying to appear a little cold, or at least disinterested, but it was a very weak effort. "That's the truth, though just the same," insisted Clyde. "Well, I think it's beautiful myself," admitted Roberta. "I've been out here, too, several times now, my friend and I." Clyde was once more delighted. She was smiling now and full of wonder. "Oh, have you?" he exclaimed. And there was more talk as to why he liked to come out and how he'd learned to swim here. "And to think I turned in here, and there you were on the bank, looking at those water lilies. Wasn't that queer? I almost fell out of the boat. I don't think I ever saw you look as pretty as you did just now standing there." "Oh, now, Mr. Griffiths," again pleaded Roberta cautiously, "you mustn't begin that way. I'll be afraid you're a dreadful flatterer. I'll have to think you are if you say anything like that so quickly." Clyde once more gazed at her weakly, and she smiled because she thought he was more handsome than ever. But what would he think, she added to herself, if she were to tell him that just before he came round that point she was thinking of him too, and wishing that he were there with her and not Grace, and how they might sit and talk and hold hands perhaps. He might even put his arms around her waist, and she might let him. That would be terrible, as some people here would see it, she knew. And it would never do for him to know that, never. That would be too intimate, too bold. But just the same it was so. Yet what would these people here in Lycurgus think of her and him, now if they could see her, letting him paddle her about in this canoe? He a factory manager, and she an employee in his department. The conclusion, the scandal maybe even. And yet Grace Marr was along, or soon would be, and she would explain to her, surely. He was out rowing and knew her, and why shouldn't he help her get some lilies if he wanted to? It was almost unavoidable, this present situation, wasn't it? Already Clyde had maneuvered the canoe around, so that they were now among the water lilies, and as he talked, having laid his paddle aside, he'd been reaching over and pulling them up, tossing them with their long wet stems at her feet as she lay reclining in the seat, one hand over the side of the canoe in the water, as she'd seen other girls holding theirs, and for the moment her thoughts were allayed and modified by the beauty of his head and arms and the tousled hair that now fell over his eyes. How handsome he was! Chapter 16. The outcome of that afternoon was so wonderful for both that for days thereafter neither could cease thinking about it or marveling that anything so romantic and charming should have brought them together so intimately, when both were considering that it was not wise for either to know the other any better than employee and superior. After a few moments of badinage in the boat, in which he talked about the beauty of the lilies, and how glad he was to get them for her, they picked up her friend Grace, and eventually returned to the boathouse. Once on the land again, they developed not a little hesitation on her part as well as his, as to how farther to proceed, for they were confronted by the problem of returning into Lycurgus together. As Roberta saw it, it would not look right, and might create talk, and on his part he was thinking of Gilbert and other people he knew, the trouble that might come of it, what Gilbert would say if he did hear, and so both he and she, as well as Grace, were dubious on the instant about the wisdom of riding back together. Grace's own reputation, as well as the fact that she knew Clyde was not interested in her, piqued her, and Roberta, realizing this from her manner, said, "What do you think we'd better do? Excuse ourselves?" At once Roberta tried to think just how they could extricate themselves gracefully without offending Clyde. Personally, she was so enchanted that had she been alone she would have preferred to have ridden back with him. But with Grace here and in this cautious mood, never. She must think up some excuse. And at the same time Clyde was wondering just how he was to do now, ride in with them and brazenly face the possibility of being seen by someone who might carry the news to Gilbert Griffiths, or evade doing so on some pretext or other. He could think of none, however, and was about to turn and accompany them to the car when the young electrician, Sherlock, who lived in the Newton household and who had been on the balcony of the pavilion, hailed them. He was with a friend who had a small car, and they were ready to return to the city. "Well, here's luck," he exclaimed. "How are you, Miss Holden? How do you do, Miss Marr? You two don't happen to be going our way, do you? If you are, we can take you in with us." Not only Roberta but Clyde heard, and at once she was about to say that, since it was a little late and she and Grace were scheduled to attend church services with the Newtons, it would be more convenient for them to return this way. She was, however, half hoping that Sherlock would invite Clyde and that he would accept. But on his doing so, Clyde instantly refused. He explained that he decided to stay out a little while longer, and so Roberta left him with a look that conveyed clearly enough the gratitude and delight she felt. They had had such a good time, and he, in turn, in spite of many qualms as to the wisdom of all this, fell to brooding on how sad it was that just he and Roberta might not have remained here for hours longer, and immediately after they'd gone he returned to the city alone. The next morning he was keener than ever to see Roberta again, and although the peculiarly exposed nature of the work at the factory made it impossible for him to demonstrate his feelings, still by the swift and admiring and seeking smiles that played over his face and blazed in his eyes, she knew that he was as enthusiastic, if not more so, as on the night before. And on her part, although she felt that a crisis of some sort was impending, and in spite of the necessity of a form of secrecy which she resented, she could not refrain from giving him a warm and quite yielding glance in return. The wonder of his being interested in her, the wonder and the thrill. Clyde decided at once that his attentions were still welcome, also that he might risk saying something to her, supposing that a suitable opportunity offered. And so, after waiting an hour and seeing two fellow workers leave from either side of her, he seized the occasion to drift near and to pick up one of the collars she just stamped, saying, as though talking about that, "I was awfully sorry to have to leave you last night. I wish we were out there again today instead of here, just you and me, don't you?" Roberta turned, conscious that now was the time to decide whether she would encourage or discourage any attention on his part. At the same time she was almost faintingly eager to accept his attentions, regardless of the problem in connection with him. His eyes, his hair, his hands. And then, instead of rebuking or chilling him in any way, she only looked, but with eyes too weak and melting to mean anything less than yielding and uncertainty. Clyde saw that she was hopelessly and helplessly drawn to him, as indeed he was to her. On the instant he was resolved to say something more when he could, as to where they could meet when no one was alone, for it was plain that she was no more anxious to be observed than he was. He well knew more sharply today than ever before that he was treading on dangerous ground. He began to make mistakes in his calculations, to feel that with her so near him, he was by no means concentrating on the various tasks before him. She was too enticing, too compelling in so many ways to him. There was something so warm and gay and welcome about her that he felt that if he could persuade her to love him, he would be among the most fortunate of men. Yet there was that rule. And although on the lake the day before he had been deciding that his position here was by no means as satisfactory as it should be, still, with Roberta in it, as now it seemed she well might be, would it not be much more delightful for him to stay? Could he not, for the time being at least, endure the further indifference of the Griffiths? And who knows, might they not yet become interested in him as a suitable social figure, if only he did nothing to offend them? And yet here he was attempting to do exactly the thing he'd been forbidden to do. What kind of an injunction was this, anyhow, wherewith Gilbert had enjoined him? If he could come to some understanding with her, perhaps she would meet him in some clandestine way, and thus obviate all possibility of criticism. It was thus that Clyde, seated at his desk or walking about, was thinking. For now his mind, even in the face of his duties, was almost entirely engaged by her, and he could think of nothing else. He had decided to suggest that they meet for the first time, if she would, in a small park which was just west of the first outlying resort on the Mohawk. But throughout the day, so close to each other did the girls work, he had no opportunity to communicate with her. Indeed, noontime came, and he went below to his lunch, returning a little early in the hope of finding her sufficiently detached to permit him to whisper that he wished to see her somewhere. But she was surrounded by others at the time, and so the entire afternoon went by without a single opportunity. However, as he was going out, he bethought him that if he should chance to meet her alone somewhere in the street, he would venture to speak to her. For she wanted him to, that he knew, regardless of what she might say at any time. And he must find some way that would appear as accidental, and hence as innocent to her as to the others. But as the whistle blew and she left the building, she was joined by another girl, and he was left to think of some other way. That same evening, however, instead of lingering about the Peyton house or going to a moving picture theater, as he so often did now, or walking alone somewhere in order to allay his unrest and loneliness, he chose now instead to seek out the home of Roberta on Taylor Street. It was not a pleasing house, as he now decided, not nearly so attractive as Mrs. Cuppy's or the house in which he now dwelt. It was too old and brown, the neighborhood too nondescript, if conservative. But the lights in different rooms glowing at this early hour gave it a friendly and genial look, and the few trees in front were pleasant. What was Roberta doing now? Why couldn't she have waited for him in the factory? Why couldn't she sense now that he was outside and come out? He wished intensely that in some way he could make her feel that he was out here, and so cause her to come out. But she didn't. On the contrary, he observed Mr. Sherlock issue forth and disappear toward Central Avenue, and after that pedestrian after pedestrian making their way out of different houses along the street and toward Central, which caused him to walk briskly about the block in order to avoid being seen. At the same time he sighed often, because it was such a fine night, a full moon rising about 9:30 and hanging heavy and yellow over the chimney-tops. He was so lonely. But at 10, the moon becoming too bright and no Roberta appearing, he decided to leave. It was not wise to be hanging about here. But the night being so fine, he resented the thought of his room, and instead walked up and down Waikiki Avenue, looking at the fine houses there, his Uncle Samuel's among them. Now all their occupants were away at their summer places. The houses were dark, and Sandra Finchley and Bertine Cranston and all that company, what were they doing on a night like this? Where dancing? Where speeding? Where loving? It was so hard to be poor, not to have money and position, and to be able to do in life exactly as you wished. And the next morning, more eager than usual, he was out of Mrs. Peyton's by 6:45, anxious to find some way of renewing his attentions to Roberta. For there was that crowd of factory workers that proceeded north along Central Avenue, and she would be a unit in it, of course, at about 7:10. But his trip to the factory was fruitless, for after swallowing a cup of coffee at one of the small restaurants near the post office, and walking the length of Central Avenue toward the mill, and pausing at a cigar store to see if Roberta should by any chance come along alone, he was rewarded by the sight of her with Grace Marr again. What a wretched, crazy world this was, it once decided, and how difficult it was in this miserable town for anyone to meet anyone else alone. Everyone, nearly, knew everyone else. Besides, Roberta knew that he was trying to get a chance to talk to her. Why shouldn't she walk alone, then? He'd looked at her enough yesterday, and yet here she was walking with Grace Marr and appeared seemingly contented. What was the matter with her, anyhow? By the time he reached the factory he was very sour, but the sight of Roberta taking her place at her bench and tossing him a genial "good morning" with a cheerful smile caused him to feel better, and that all was not lost. It was 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and the lull due to the afternoon heat, the fag of steadily continued work, and the flare of reflected light from the river outside was over all. The tap, tap, tap of metal stamps upon scores of collars at once, nearly always slightly audible above the hum and whir of the sewing machines beyond, was, if anything, weaker than usual, and there was Ruza, Nikofrich, Hoda Petkanas, Martha Bordelou, Angelina Pitti, and Lena Schlicht, all joining in a song called Sweethearts, which someone had started. And Roberta, perpetually conscious of Clyde's eyes as well as his mood, was thinking how long it would be before he would come around with some word in regard to something, for she wished him to, and because of his whispered words of the day before, she was sure that it would not be long, because he would not be able to resist it. His eyes the night before had told her that. Yet because of the impediments of this situation, she knew that he must be having a difficult time thinking of any way by which he could say anything to her. And still at certain moments she was glad, for there were such moments when she felt she needed the security which the presence of so many girls gave her. And as she thought of all this, stamping at her desk along with the others, she suddenly discovered that a bundle of collars which he'd already stamped as 16s were not of that size, but smaller. She looked at it quickly and nervously, then decided that there was but one thing to do: lay the bundle aside and await comment from one of the foremen, including Clyde, or take it directly to him now. Really the better way, because it prevented any of the foremen seeing it before he did. That was what all the girls did when they made mistakes of any kind, and all trained girls were supposed to catch all possible errors of that kind. And yet now, in the face of all her very urgent desires, she hesitated, for this would take her direct to Clyde and give him the opportunity he was seeking. But, more terrifying, it was giving her the opportunity she was seeking. She wavered between loyalty to Clyde as a superintendent, loyalty to her old conventions as opposed to her new and dominating desire, and her repressed wish to have Clyde speak to her, then went over with a bundle and laid it on his desk. But her hands, as she did so, trembled. Her face was white, her throat taut. At the moment, as it chanced, he was almost vainly trying to calculate the scores of the different girls from the stubs laid before him, and was having a hard time of it, because his mind was not on what he was doing. And then he looked up, and there was Roberta bending toward him. His nerves became very taut, his throat and lips dry, for here and now was his opportunity. And as he could see, Roberta was almost suffocating from the strain which her daring and self-deception was putting upon her nerves and heart. "There's been a mistake," she meant to say mistake. "In regard to this bundle upstairs," she began. "I didn't notice it either until I'd stamped nearly all of them. They're 15.5, and I've stamped nearly all of them 16. I'm sorry." Clyde noticed as she said this that she was trying to smile a little and appear calm, but her cheeks were quite blanched, and her hands, particularly the one that held the bundle, trembled. On the instant he realized that although loyalty and order were bringing her with this mistake to him, still there was more than that to it. In a weak, frightened, and yet love-driven way, she was courting him, giving him the opportunity he was seeking, wishing him to take advantage of it. And he, embarrassed and shaken for the moment by this sudden visitation, was still heartened and hardened into a kind of effrontery and gallantry such as he'd not felt as yet in regard to her. She was seeking him, that was plain. She was interested, and clever enough to make the occasion which permitted him to speak. Wonderful, the sweetness of her daring. "Oh, that's all right," he said, pretending a courage and a daring in regard to her which he did not feel even now. "I'll just send them down to the washroom, and then we'll see if we can't restamp them again. It's not our mistake, really." He smiled most warmly, and she met his look with a repressed smile of her own, already turning and fearing that she had manifested too clearly what had brought her. "But don't go," he added quickly. "I want to ask you something. I've been trying to get a word with you ever since Sunday. I want you to meet me somewhere. Will you? There's a rule here that says a head of a department can't have anything to do with a girl who works for him. Outside, I mean. But I want you to see me just the same, won't you? You know," and he smiled winsomely and coaxingly into her eyes, "I've been just nearly crazy over you ever since you came in here and Sunday made it worse. And now I'm not going to let any old rule come between me and you if I can help it. Will you?" "Oh, I don't know whether I can do that or not," replied Roberta, who, now that she had succeeded in accomplishing what she'd wished, was becoming terrorized by her own daring. She began looking around nervously and feeling that every eye in the room must be upon her. "I live with Mr. and Mrs. Newton, my friend's sister and brother-in-law, you know, and they're very strict. It isn't the same as if—" she was going to add, "I was at home," but Clyde interrupted her. "Oh, now, please don't say no, will you? Please don't. I want to see you. I don't want to cause you any trouble, that's all. Otherwise, I'd be glad to come around to your house. You know how it is." "Oh, no, you mustn't do that," cautioned Roberta. "Not yet, anyhow." She was so confused that quite unconsciously she was giving Clyde to understand that she was expecting him to come around some time later. "Well," smiled Clyde, who could see that she was yielding in part, "we could just walk out near the end of some street here, that street you live in if you wish. There are no houses out there. Or there's a little park, Mohawk, just west of Dreamland on the Mohawk street line. It's right on the river. You might come out there. I could meet you where the car stops. Will you do that?" "Oh, I'd be afraid to do that, I think. Go so far, I mean. I never did anything like that before." She looked so innocent and frank as she said this that Clyde was quite carried away by the sweetness of her. And to think he was making a clandestine appointment with her. "I'm almost afraid to go anywhere here alone, you know. People talk so here, they say, and someone will be sure to see me. But—" "Yes, but what?" "I'm afraid I'm staying too long at your desk here, don't you think?" She actually gasped as she said it, and Clyde, realizing the openness of it, although there was really nothing very unusual about it, now spoke quickly and forcefully. "Well then, how about the end of that street you live in? Couldn't you come down there for just a little while tonight? A half hour or so, maybe?" "Oh, I couldn't make it tonight, I think. Not so soon. I'll have to see first, you know. Arrange, that is. But another day." She was so excited and troubled by this great adventure of hers that her face, like Clyde's at times, changed from a half-smile to a half-frown, without her realizing that it was registering these changes. "Well, then, how about Wednesday night at 8:30 or 9? Couldn't you do that? Please, now." Roberta considered most sweetly, nervously. Clyde was enormously fascinated by her manner at the moment, for she looked around, conscious, as though she seemed, that she was being observed, and that her stay here for her first visit was very long. "I suppose I'd better be going back to my work now," she replied, without really answering him. "Wait a minute," plead Clyde. "We haven't fixed on the time for Wednesday. Aren't you going to meet me? Make it 9 or 8:30 or any time you want to. I'll be there waiting for you after 8 if you wish. Will you?" "All right, then. Say 8:30, or between 8:30 and 9 if I can. Is that all right? I'll come if I can, you know, and if anything does happen I'll tell you the next morning, you see." She flushed, and then looked around once more, a foolish, flustered look, then hurried back to her bench, fairly tingling from head to toe, and looking as guilty as though she'd been caught red-handed in some dreadful crime. And Clyde at his desk was almost choking with excitement. The wonder of her agreeing, of his talking to her like that, of her venturing to make a date with him at all here in Lycurgus, where he was so well known. Thrilling. For her part, she was thinking how wonderful it would be just to walk and talk with him in the moonlight, to feel the pressure of his arm, and hear his soft, appealing voice. Chapter 17. It was quite dark when Roberta stole out on Wednesday night to meet Clyde. But before that, what qualms and meditations in the face of her willingness and her agreement to do so, for not only was it difficult for her to overcome her own mental scruples within, But in addition, there was all the trouble in connection with the commonplace and religious and narrow atmosphere in which she found herself embedded at the Newtons. For since coming here she'd scarcely gone anywhere without Grace Marr. Besides, on this occasion, a thing she'd forgotten in talking to Clyde, she'd agreed to go with the Newtons and Grace to the Gideon Baptist Church, where a Wednesday prayer meeting was to be followed by a social with games, cake, tea, and ice cream. In consequence, she was troubled severely as to how to manage, until it came back to her that a day or two before Mr. Liggett, in noting how rapid and efficient she was, had observed that any time she wanted to learn one phase of the stitching operations going on in the next room, he would have her taken in hand by Mrs. Brayley, who would teach her. And now that Clyde's invitation and this church affair fell on the same night, she decided to say that she had an appointment with Mrs. Brayley at her home. Only, as she also decided, she would wait until just before dinner Wednesday, and then say that Mrs. Brayley had invited her to come to her house. Then she could see Clyde, and by the time the Newtons and Grace returned, she could be back. Oh, how it would feel to have him talk to her, say again, as he did in the boat, that he'd never had seen anyone look so pretty as she did standing on the bank and looking for water lilies. Many, many thoughts, vague, dreadful, colorful, came to her. How and where they might go, do from now on. If only she could arrange to be friends with him without harm to her or him. If need be, she now decided, she could resign from the factory and get a place somewhere else, a change which would absolve Clyde from any responsibility in regard to her. There was, however, another mental as well as emotional phase in regard to all this that related to her clothes, for since coming to Lycurgus, she had learned that the more intelligent girls had dressed better than did those about Bilt's and Trippett's mills. At the same time she had been sending a fair portion of her money to her mother, sufficient to have equipped her exceptionally well, as she now realized, had she retained it. But now that Clyde was swaying her so greatly, she was troubled about her looks, and on the evening after her conversation with him at the mill, she had gone through her small wardrobe, fixing upon a soft blue hat, which Clyde had not yet seen, together with a checkered blue and white flannel skirt and a pair of white canvas shoes, purchased the previous summer at Bilt's. Her plan was to wait until the Newtons and Grace had departed for church, and then swiftly dress and leave. At 8:30, when night had finally fallen, she went east along Taylor to Central Avenue, then by a circuitous route made her way west again to the trysting place, and Clyde was already there. Against an old wooden fence that enclosed a 5-acre cornfield, he was leaning and looking back towards the interesting little city, the lights in so many of the houses of which were aglow through the trees. The air was laden with spices, the mingled fragrance of many grasses and flowers. There was a light wind stirring in the long swords of the corn at his back, in the leaves of the trees overhead, and there were stars, the Big Dipper and the Little Dipper and the Milky Way, sidereal phenomena which his mother had pointed out to him long ago. And he was thinking how different was his position here to what it had been in Kansas City. There he'd been so nervous in regard to Hortense Briggs, or any girl really, afraid almost to say a word to any of them, whereas here, and especially since he'd had charge of this stamping room, he'd seemed to become aware of the fact that he was more attractive than he'd ever thought he was before, also that the girls were attracted to him, and that he was not so much afraid of them. The eyes of Roberta herself showed him this day how much she was drawn to him. She was his girl, and when she came, he would put his arms around her and kiss her, and she would not be able to resist him. He stood listening, dreaming and watching, the rustling corn behind him stirring an old recollection in him, when suddenly he saw her coming. She looked trim and brisk and yet nervous, and paused at the street end, and looked about like a frightened and cautious animal. At once Clyde hurried forward toward her and called softly, "Hello. Gee, it's nice to have you meet me. Did you have any trouble?" He was thinking how much more pleasing she was than either Hortense Briggs or Rita Dickerman, the one so calculating, the other so sensually free and indiscriminate. "Did I have any trouble? Oh, didn't I, though?" And at once she plunged into a full and picturesque account, not only of the mistake in regard to the Newtons' church night and her engagement with them, but of a determination on the part of Grace Marr not to go to the church social without her, and how she had to fib, oh, so terribly, about going over to Mrs. Brayley's to learn to stitch. A Liggett-Roberta development, of which Clyde had heard nothing so far, and concerning which he was intensely curious, because at once it raised the thought that already Liggett might be intending to remove her from under his care. He proceeded to question her about that, before he would let her go on with her story, an interest which Roberta noticed, and because of which she was very pleased. "But I can't stay very long, you know," she explained briskly and warmly at the first opportunity. The while Clyde laid hold of her arm and turned her toward the river, which was to the north and untenanted this far out. "The Baptist Church socials never last much beyond 10:30 or 11, and they'll be back soon, so I'll have to manage to be back before they are." Then she gave many reasons why it would be unwise for her to be out after 10, reasons which annoyed yet convinced Clyde by their wisdom. He'd been hoping to keep her out longer, but seeing that the time was to be brief, he was all the keener for a closer contact with her now, and fell to complimenting her on her pretty hat and cape and how becoming they were. At once he tried to put his arm about her waist, but feeling this to be a too swift advance, she removed his arm, or tried to, saying in the softest and most coaxing voice, Now, that's not nice, is it? Can't you just hold my arm or let me hold yours?" But he noted, once she persuaded him to disengage her waist, she took his arm in a clinging, snuggling embrace and measured her stride to his. On the instant he was thinking how natural and unaffected her manner was now that the ice between them had been broken, and how she went on babbling. She liked Lycurgus, only she thought it was the most religious town she'd ever been in, worse than Bill's or Trippett's Mills that way. And then she had to explain to Clyde what Bill's and Trippett Mills were like, and her home a very little, for she did not care to talk about that, and then back to the Newtons and Grace Marr, and how they watched her every move. Clyde was thinking as she talked how different she was from Hortense Briggs or Rita or any other girl he'd ever known, so much more simple and confiding, not in any way mushy as was Rita, or brash or vain or pretentious as was Hortense, and yet really as pretty and so much sweeter. He could not help thinking if she were smartly dressed how sweet she would be. And again he was wondering what she would think of him, and his attitude toward Hortense in contrast to his attitude toward her now, if she knew. "You know," he said at the very first opportunity, "I've been trying to talk to you ever since you came to work at the factory, but you see how very watchful everyone is. They're the limit. They told me when I came up there that I mustn't interest myself in any girl working there, and so I tried not to. But I just couldn't help this, could I?" He squeezed her arm affectionately, then stopped suddenly, and disengaging his arm from hers, put both his about her. "You know, Roberta, I'm crazy about you. I really am. I think you're the dearest, sweetest thing. Oh, say, do you mind my telling you? Ever since you showed up there, I haven't been able to sleep, nearly. That's the truth, honest it is. I think and think of you. You've got such nice eyes and hair. Tonight you look just too cute. Lovely, I think. Oh, Roberta!" Suddenly he caught her face between his two hands and kissed her, before really she could evade him. Then, having done this, he held her while she resisted him, although it was almost impossible for her to do so. Instead, she felt as though she wanted to put her arms around him, or have him hold her tight, and this mood in regard to him and herself puzzled and troubled her. It was awful. What would people think, say, if they knew? She was a bad girl, really, and yet she wanted to be this way, near him, now as never before. "Oh, you mustn't, Mr. Griffiths," she pleaded. "You really mustn't, you know. Please, someone might see us. I think I hear someone coming. Please, now." She looked about quite frightened, apparently, while Clyde laughed ecstatically. Life had presented him a delicious sweet at last. "You know I never did anything like this before," she went on. "Honest, I didn't. Please. It's only because you said—" Clyde was pressing her close, not saying anything in reply. His pale face and dark, hungry eyes held very close to hers. He kissed her again and again, despite her protests, her little mouth and chin and cheeks seeming too beautiful, too irresistible, then murmured pleadingly, for he was too overcome to speak vigorously, "Oh, Roberta, dearest, please, please say that you love me. Please do. I know that you do, Roberta. I can tell. Please tell me now. I'm crazy about you. We have so little time." He kissed her again upon the cheek and mouth, and suddenly he felt her relax. She stood quite still and unresisting in his arms. He felt a wonder of something, he could not tell what. All of a sudden he felt tears upon her face, her head sunk to his shoulder, and then he heard her say, "Yes, yes, yes, I do love you. Yes, yes, I do, I do." There was a sob, half of misery, half of delight, in her voice, and Clyde caught that. He was so touched by her honesty and simplicity that tears sprang to his own eyes. "It's all right, Roberta. It's all right. Please don't cry. Oh, I think you're sweet. I do, Roberta." He looked up, and before him in the east over the low roofs of the city was the thinnest, yellowest, topmost arc of the rising July moon. It seemed at the moment as though life had given him all that he could possibly ask of it. Chapter 18. The culmination of this meeting was but the prelude, as both Clyde and Roberta realized, to a series of contacts and rejoicings which were to extend over an indefinite period. They had found love. They were deliciously happy, whatever the problems attending its present realization might be, but the ways and means of continuing with it were a different matter, for not only was their connection with the Newtons a bar to any normal procedure, insofar as Clyde was concerned, but Grace Marr herself offered a distinct and separate problem. Far more than Roberta, she was chained, not only by the defect of poor looks, but by the narrow teachings and domestic training of her early social and religious life. She wanted to be gay and free, too, and in Roberta, who, while gay and boastful at times, was still well within the conventions that chained Grace, she imagined that she saw one who was not so bound, and so it was that she clung to her closely, and as Roberta saw it, a little wearisomely. She imagined that they could exchange ideas and jests and confidences in regard to the love life and their respective dreams without injury to each other, and to date this was her one solace in an otherwise grey world. But Roberta, even before the arrival of Clyde in her life, did not want to be so clung to. It was a bore, and afterwards she developed an inhibition in regard to him where Grace was concerned, for she not only knew that Grace would resent this sudden desertion, but also that she had no desire to face out within herself the sudden and revolutionary moods which now possessed her. Having at once met and loved him, she was afraid to think what, if anything, she proposed to permit herself to do in regard to him. Were not such contacts between the classes banned here? She knew they were, and she did not care to talk about him at all. In consequence, on Monday evening following the Sunday on the lake, when Grace had inquired most gaily and familiarly after Clyde, Roberta had as instantly decided not to appear nearly as interested in him as Grace might already be imagining. Accordingly, she said little other than that he was very pleasant to her, and had inquired after Grace, a remark which caused the latter to eye her slyly, and to wonder if she were really telling what had happened since. "He was so very friendly, I was beginning to think he was struck on you." "Oh, what nonsense!" Roberta replied shrewdly and a bit alarmed. "Why, he wouldn't look at me. Besides, there's a rule of the company that doesn't permit him to, as long as I work there." This last, more than anything else, served to allay Grace's notions in regard to Clyde and Roberta, for she was of that conventional turn of mind which was scarcely permitted to think of anyone infringing upon a company rule. Nevertheless, Roberta was nervous lest Grace should be associating her and Clyde in her mind in some clandestine way, and she decided to be doubly cautious in regard to Clyde. To feign a distance she did not feel. But all this was preliminary to troubles and strains and fears which had nothing to do with what had gone before, but took their rise from difficulties which sprang up immediately afterwards. For once she'd come to this complete emotional understanding with Clyde, she saw no way of meeting him except in this very clandestine way, and that so very rarely and uncertainly that she could not say when there was likely to be another meeting. "You see, it's this way," she explained to Clyde, when a few evenings later she'd managed to steal out for an hour, and they walked from the region at the end of Taylor Street down to the Mohawk, where there were some open fields and a low bank rising above the pleasant river. "The Newtons never go any place much without inviting me, and even if they didn't, Grace would never go unless I went along. It's just because we were together so much in Trippett's Mills that she feels that way, and as though I were part of the family. But now it's different, and yet I don't see how I'm going to get out of it so soon. I don't know where to say I'm going, or whom I'm going with." "I know that, honey," he replied softly and sweetly. That's all true enough. But how is that going to help us now? You can't expect me to get along with just looking at you in the factory either, can you?" He gazed at her so solemnly and yearningly that she was moved by her sympathy for him, and in order to assuage his depression added, "No, I don't want you to do that, dear. You know I don't. But what am I to do?" She laid a soft and pleading hand on the back of one of Clyde's thin, long, and nervous ones. "I'll tell you what, though," she went on after a period of reflection. "I have a sister living in Homer, New York. That's about 35 miles north of here. I might say I was going up there some Saturday afternoon or Sunday. She's been writing me to come up, but I hadn't thought of it before. But I might go, that is, I might—" "Oh, why not do that?" exclaimed Clyde eagerly. "That's fine. A good idea." "Let me see," she added, ignoring his exclamation. "If I remember right, you have to go to Fonda first, then change cars there. But I could leave here any time on the trolley, and there are only 2 trains a day from Fonda, one at 2 and one at 7 on Saturday. So I might leave here any time before 2, you see, and then if I didn't make the 2 o'clock train, it would be all right, wouldn't it? I could go on the 7, and you could be over there, or meet me on the way, just so no one here saw us. Then I could go on, and you could come back. I could arrange that with Agnes, I'm sure. I would have to write her." "How about all the time between then and now, though?" he queried peevishly. "It's a long time till then, you know." "Well, I'll have to see what I can think of, but I'm not sure, dear. I'll have to see. And you think, too. But I ought to be going back now," she added nervously. She at once arose, causing Clyde to rise too and consult his watch, thereby discovering that it was already near 10. "But what about us?" he continued persistently. "Why couldn't you pretend next Sunday that you're going to some other church than yours and meet me somewhere instead? Would they have to know?" At once Clyde noted Roberta's face darken slightly, for here he was encroaching upon something that was still too closely identified with her early youth and convictions to permit infringement. She replied quite solemnly. "I wouldn't want to do that. I wouldn't feel right about it, and it wouldn't be right either." Immediately Clyde sensed that he was treading on dangerous ground, and withdrew the suggestion because he did not care to offend or frighten her in any way. "Oh, well, just as you say. I only thought, since you don't seem to be able to think of any other way—" "No, no, dear," she pleaded softly, because she noted that he felt that she might be offended. "It's all right, only I wouldn't want to do that. I couldn't." Clyde shook his head. A recollection of his own youthful inhibitions caused him to feel that perhaps it was not right for him to have suggested it. They returned in the direction of Taylor Street without, apart from the proposed trip to Fonda, either having hit upon any definite solution. Instead, after kissing her again and again, and just before letting her go, the best he could suggest was that they were both to try and think of some way by which they could meet before, if possible. And she, after throwing her arms about his neck for a moment, ran east along Taylor Street, her little figure swaying in the moonlight. However, apart from another evening meeting, which was made possible by Roberta's announcing a second engagement with Mrs. Brayley, there was no other encounter until the following Saturday, when Roberta departed for Fonda, and Clyde, having ascertained the exact hour, left by the car ahead and joined Roberta at the first station west. From that point on until evening, when she was compelled to take the 7 o'clock train, they were unspeakably happy together, loitering near the little city comparatively strange to both. For outside of Fonda, a few miles, they came to a pleasure park called Starlight, where, in addition to a few claptrap pleasure concessions, such as a ring of captive aeroplanes, a Ferris wheel, a merry-go-round, an old mill, and a dance-floor, was a small lake with boats. It was after its fashion an idyllic spot, with a little bandstand out on an island near the center of the lake, and on the shore a grave and captive bear in a cage. Since coming to Lycurgus, Roberta had not ventured to visit any of the rougher resorts near there, which were very much like this, only much more strident. On sight of this both exclaimed, "Oh, look!" And Clyde added at once, "Let's get off here, will you? Shall we? What do you say? We're almost to Fonda anyhow, and we can have more fun here." At once they climbed down, and having disposed of her bag for the time being, he led the way first to the stand of a man who sold frankfurters. Then, since the merry-go-round was in full blast, Nothing would do but that Roberta should ride with him. And in the gayest of moods they climbed on, and he placed her on a zebra, and then stood close in order that he might keep his arm about her, and both try to catch the brass ring. And as commonplace and noisy and gaudy as it all was, the fact that at last he had her all to himself unseen, and she him, was sufficient to evoke in both a kind of ecstasy, which was all out of proportion to the fragile gimcrack scene. Round and round they spun on the noisy grinding machine, surveying now a few idle pleasure-seekers who were in boats upon the lake, now some who were flying round in the gaudy green and white captive aeroplanes, or turning upward and then down in the suspended cages of the Ferris wheel. Both looked at the woods and sky beyond the lake, the idlers and dancers in the dancing pavilion, dreaming and thrilling, and then suddenly Clyde asked, "You dance, don't you, Roberta?" "Why, no, I don't," she replied, a little sadly, for at the very moment she had been looking at the happy dancers rather ruefully, and thinking how unfortunate it was that she had never been allowed to dance. This book is continued on cassette number 8, side 1. Please fast forward to the end of this tape. An American Tragedy, continuing on cassette number 8, side 1. It might not be right or nice to dance, perhaps. Her own church said it was not. But still, now that they were here and in love like this, these others looked so gay and happy, a pretty medley of colors moving round and round in the green and brown frame. It did not seem so bad to her. Why shouldn't people dance anyway? Girls like herself and boys like Clyde. Her younger brother and sister, in spite of the views of her parents, were already declaring that when the opportunity offered they were going to learn. "Oh, isn't that too bad?" he exclaimed, thinking how delightful it would be to hold Roberta in his arms. "We could have such fun now if you could. I could teach you in a few minutes if you wanted me to." "I don't know about that," she replied quizzically, her eyes showing that his suggestion appealed to her. "I'm not so clever that way, and you know dancing isn't considered so very nice in my part of the country, and my church doesn't approve of it either, and I know my parents wouldn't like me to." "Oh, shucks," replied Clyde, foolishly and gaily. "What nonsense, Roberta! Why, everybody dances these days, or nearly everybody. How can you think there's anything wrong with it?" "Oh, I know," replied Roberta, oddly and quaintly. "Maybe they do in your set. I know most of the factory girls do, of course, and I suppose where you have money and position everything's right. But with a girl like me it's different. I don't suppose your parents were as strict as mine either." "Oh, weren't they, though?" laughed Clyde, who had not failed to catch the "your" set, also the "where you have money and position." "Well, that's all you know about it," he went on. "They were as strict as yours, and stricter, I'll bet. But I danced just the same. Why, there's no harm in it, Roberta. Come on, let me teach you. It's wonderful, really. Won't you, dearest?" He put his arm around her and looked into her eyes, and she half relented, quite weakened by her desire for him. Just then the merry-go-round stopped, and without any plan or suggestion, they seemed instinctively to drift to the side of the pavilion where the dancers, not many but avid, were moving briskly around. Fox-trots and one-steps were being supplied by an orchestrelle of considerable size. At a turnstile, all the remaining portions of the pavilion being screened in, a pretty concessionaire was sitting and taking tickets, 10 cents per dance per couple. But the color and the music and the motions of the dancers, gliding rhythmically here and there, quite seized upon both Clyde and Roberta. The orchestra stopped and the dancers were coming out, but no sooner were they out than 5-cent admission checks were once more sold for the new dance. "I don't believe I can," pleaded Roberta, as Clyde led her to the ticket stile. "I'm afraid I'm too awkward, maybe. I never danced, you know." "You awkward, Roberta?" he exclaimed. "Oh, how crazy! Why, you're as graceful and pretty as you can be. You'll see. You'll be a wonderful dancer." Already he'd paid the coin, and they were inside. Carried away by a bravado, which was 3/4 her conception of him as a member of the Lycurgus upper crust and possessor of means and position, he led the way into a corner and began at once to illustrate the respective movements. They were not difficult, and for a girl of Roberta's natural grace and zest, easy. Once the music started, and Clyde drew her to him, She fell into the positions and steps without effort, and they moved rhythmically and instinctively together. It was the delightful sensation of being held by him and guided here and there that so appealed to her, the wonderful rhythm of his body coinciding with hers. "Oh, you darling," he whispered. "Aren't you the dandy little dancer, though? You've caught on already. If you aren't the wonderful kid, I can hardly believe it." They went about the floor once more, then a third time, before the music stopped, and by the time it did, Roberta was lost in a sense of delight, such as had never come to her before. To think that she'd been dancing, and it should be so wonderful, and with Clyde. He was so slim, graceful, quite the handsomest of any of the young men on the floor, she thought, and he in turn was now thinking that never had he known anyone as sweet as Roberta. She was so gay and winsome and yielding. She would not try to work him for anything, and as for Sandra Finchley, well, she'd ignored him, and he might as well dismiss her from his mind. And yet, even here and with Roberta, he could not quite forget her. At 5:30, when the orchestra was silenced for lack of customers and a sign reading, "Next concert, 7:30, hung up, they were still dancing. After that they went for an ice-cream soda, then for something to eat, and by then so swiftly had sped the time, it was necessary to take the very next car for the depot at Fonda. As they neared this terminal, both Clyde and Roberta were full of schemes as to how they were to arrange for tomorrow. For Roberta would be coming back then, and if she could arrange to leave her sisters a little early Sunday, he could come over from Lycurgus to meet her. They could linger around Fonda until 11 at least, when the last train south from Homer was due, and pretending she'd arrived on that, they could then, assuming there was no one whom they knew on the Lycurgus car, journey to that city. And as arranged, so they met, and in the dark outlying streets of that city walked and talked and planned, and Roberta told Clyde something, though not much, of her home life at Bill's. But the great thing, apart from their love for each other and its immediate expression in kisses and embraces, was the how and where of further contacts. They must find some way, only really, as Roberta saw it, she must be the one to find the way, and that soon. For while Clyde was obviously very impatient and eager to be with her as much as possible, still he did not appear to be very ready with suggestions, available ones. But that, as she also saw, was not easy, for the possibility of another visit to her sister in Homer, or her parents in Bill's, was not even to be considered under a month. And apart from them, what other excuses were there? New friends at the factory, the post office, the library, the YWCA, all suggestions of Clyde's at the moment. But these spelled but an hour or two together at best, and Clyde was thinking of other weekends like this, and there were so few remaining summer weekends. Chapter 19. The return of Roberta and Clyde, as well as their outing together, was quite unobserved as they thought. On the car from Fonda they recognized no one, and at the Newtons Grace was already in bed. She merely awakened sufficiently to ask a few questions about the trip, and those were casual and indifferent. How was Roberta's sister? Had she stayed all day in Homer, or had she gone to Bill's or Trippett's Mills? Roberta explained that she had remained at her sister's. She herself must be going up pretty soon to see her parents at Trippett's Mills. Then she fell asleep. But at dinner the next night, the Misses Opal Fellis and Olive Pope, who had been kept from the breakfast table by a too-late return from Fonda, and the very region in which Roberta had spent Saturday afternoon, now seated themselves, and at once, as Roberta entered, interjected a few genial and well-meant, but insofar as Roberta was concerned, decidedly troubling observations. "Oh, there you are. Look who's back from Starlight Park. How'd you like the dancing over there, Miss Alden? We saw you, but you didn't see us." And before Roberta had time to think what to reply, Miss Fellis had added, "We tried to get your eye, but you couldn't see anyone but him, I guess. I'll say you danced swell." At once Roberta, who'd never been on very intimate terms with either of these girls, and who had neither the effrontery nor the wit to extricate herself from so swift and complete and so unexpected an exposure, flushed. She was all but speechless, and merely stared, bethinking her at once that she'd explained to Grace that she was at her sister's all day. And opposite sat Grace, looking directly at her, her lips slightly parted as though she would exclaim, "Well, of all things, and dancing! A man!" And at the head of the table George Newton, thin and meticulous and curious, his sharp eyes and nose and pointed chin now turned in her direction. But on the instant, realizing that she must say something, Roberta replied, "Oh, yes, that's so. I did go over there for a little while. Some friends of my sister's were coming over, and I went with them." She was about to add, "We didn't stay very long," but stopped herself, for at that moment a certain fighting quality which she had inherited from her mother, and which had asserted itself in the case of Grace before this, now came to her rescue. After all, why shouldn't she be at Starlight Park if she chose? And what right had the Newtons or Grace or anyone else to question her for that matter? She was paying her way. Nevertheless, as she realized, she had been caught in a deliberate lie, and all because she lived here and was constantly being questioned and looked after in regard to her very least move. Miss Pope added curiously, "I don't suppose he's a Lycurgus boy. I don't remember ever seeing him around here." "No, he isn't from here," returned Roberta shortly and coldly. For by now she was fairly quivering with the realization that she'd been caught in a falsehood before Grace. Also that Grace would resent intensely this social secrecy and desertion of her. At once she felt as though she would like to get up from the table and leave, and never return. But instead she did her best to compose herself, and now gave the two girls with whom she had never been familiar a steady look. At the same time she looked at Grace and Mr. Newton with defiance. If anything more was said, she proposed to give a fictitious name or two, friends of her brother-in-law and Homer, or better yet, to refuse to give any information whatsoever. Why should she? Nevertheless, as she learned later that evening, she was not to be spared the refusing of it. Grace, coming to their room immediately afterward, reproached her with, "I thought you said you stayed out at your sister's all the time you were gone." "Well, what if I did say it?" replied Roberta defiantly and even bitterly, but without a word in extenuation, for her thought was now that unquestionably Grace was pretending to catechize her on moral grounds, whereas in reality the real source of her anger and pique was that Roberta was slipping away from and hence neglecting her. "Well, you don't have to lie to me in order to go anywhere, or see anybody without me in the future. I don't want to go with you, and what's more, I don't want to know where you go or who you go with. But I do wish you wouldn't tell me one thing and then have George and Mary find out that it ain't so, and that you're just trying to slip away from me, or that I'm lying to them in order to protect myself. I don't want you to put me in that position." She was very hurt and sad and contentious, and Roberta could see for herself that there was no way out of this trying situation other than to move. Grace was a leech, a hanger-on. She had no life of her own, and could contrive none. As long as she was anywhere near her, she would want to devote herself to her, to share her every thought and mood with her, and yet if she told her about Clyde, she would be shocked and critical, and would unquestionably eventually turn on her, or even expose her. So she merely replied, "Oh, well, have it that way if you want to. I don't care. I don't propose to tell anything unless I choose to." And at once Grace conceived the notion that Roberta did not like her any more, and would have nothing to do with her. She arose immediately and walked out of the room, her head very high and her spine very stiff, and Roberta, realizing that she'd made an enemy of her, now wished that she was out of here. They were all too narrow here anyway. They would never understand or tolerate this clandestine relationship with Clyde, so necessary to him apparently as he'd explained, so troublesome and even disgraceful to her from one point of view, and yet so precious. She did love him, so very, very much, and she must now find some way to protect herself and him, move to another room. But that in this instance required almost more courage and decision than she could muster. The anomalous and unprotected nature of a room where one was not known, the look of it, subsequent explanation to her mother and sister, maybe. Yet to remain here after this was all but impossible, too, for the attitude of Grace, as well as the Newtons, particularly Mrs. Newton, Grace's sister, was that of the early Puritans or friends who had caught a brother or sister in a great sin. She was dancing, and secretly. There was the presence of that young man, not quite adequately explained by her trip home, to say nothing of her presence at Starlight Park. Besides, in Roberta's mind was the thought that under such definite espionage as must now follow, to say nothing of the unhappy and dictatorial attitude of Grace, she would have small chance to be with Clyde as much as she now most intensely desired. And accordingly, after 2 days of unhappy thought, and then a conference with Clyde, who was all for her immediate independence in a new room, where she would not be known or spied upon, she proceeded to take an hour or two off, and having fixed upon the southeast section of the city as one most likely to be free from contact with either the Newtons or those whom thus far she had encountered at the Newtons, she inquired there, and after little more than an hour's search found a place which pleased her. This was in an old brick house in Elm Street, occupied by an upholsterer and his wife and 2 daughters, one a local milliner and another still in school. The room offered was on the ground floor to the right of a small front porch and overlooking the street. A door off this same porch gave into a living room, which separated this room from the other parts of the house, and permitted ingress and egress without contact with any other portion of the house. And since she was still moved to meet Clyde clandestinely, this, as she now saw, was important. Besides, as she gathered from her one conversation with Mrs. Gilpin, the mother of this family, the character of this home was neither so strict nor inquisitive as that of the Newtons. Mrs. Gilpin was large, passive, cleanly, not so very alert, and about 50. She informed Roberta that as a rule she didn't care to take boarders or roomers at all, since the family had sufficient means to go on. However, since the family scarcely ever used the front room, which was rather set off from the remainder of the house, and since her husband did not object, she'd made up her mind to rent it. And again she preferred someone who worked like Roberta, a girl, not a man, and one who would be glad to have her breakfast and dinner along with her family. Since she asked no questions as to her family or connections, merely looking at her interestedly and seeming to be favorably impressed by her appearance, Roberta gathered that there were no such standards as prevailed at the Newtons. And yet what qualms in connection with the thought of moving thus? For about this entire clandestine procedure there hung, as she saw it, a sense of something untoward and even sinful, and then, on top of it all, quarreling and then breaking with Grace Marr, her one girl-friend here thus far, and the Newtons on account of it, when, as she well knew, it was entirely due to Grace that she was here at all. Supposing her parents or her sister and Homer should hear about this, through someone whom Grace knew, and think strangely of her going off by herself in Lycurgus in this way? Was it right? Was it possible that she could do things like this, and so soon after her coming here? She was beginning to feel as though her hitherto impeccable standards were crumbling. And yet there was Clyde now. Could she give him up? After many emotional aches, she decided that she could not, and accordingly, after paying a deposit and arranging to occupy the room within the next few days, she returned to her work, and after dinner the same evening announced to Mrs. Newton that she was going to move. Her premeditated explanation was that recently she had been thinking of having her younger brother and sister come and live with her, and since one or both were likely to come soon, she thought it best to prepare for them. And the Newtons, as well as Grace, feeling that this was all due to the new connections which Roberta had recently been making, and which were tending to alienate her from Grace, were now content to see her go. Plainly, she was beginning to indulge in a type of adventure of which they could not approve. Also, it was plain that she was not going to prove as useful to Grace as they had at first imagined. Possibly she knew what she was doing, but more likely she was being led astray by notions of a good time not consistent with a reserved life led by her at Trippett's Mills. And Roberta herself, once having made this move and settled herself in this new atmosphere, apart from the fact that it gave her much greater freedom in connection with Clyde, was dubious as to her present course. Perhaps, she'd moved hastily and in anger and might be sorry. Still, she'd done it now, and it could not be helped. So she proposed to try it for a while. To salve her own conscience more than anything else, she at once wrote her mother and her sister a very plausible version of why she'd been compelled to leave the Newtons. Grace had grown too possessive, domineering, and selfish. It had become unendurable. However, her mother need not worry. She was satisfactorily placed. She had a room to herself, and could now entertain Tom and Emily or her mother or Agnes in case they should ever visit her here, and she would be able to introduce them to the Gilpins, whom she proceeded to describe. Nevertheless, her underlying thought in connection with all this, in so far as Clyde and his great passion for her was concerned, and hers for him, was that she was indeed trifling with fire, and perhaps social disgrace into the bargain. For although consciously at this time she was scarcely willing to face the fact that this room, its geometric position in relation to the rest of the house, had been of the greatest import to her at the time she first saw it, yet subconsciously she knew it well enough. The course she was pursuing was dangerous, that she knew. And yet how, as she now so often asked herself at moments when she was confronted by some desire which ran counter to her sense of practicability and social morality, was she to do? Chapter 20. However, as both Roberta and Clyde soon found, after several weeks in which they met here and there, such spots as could be conveniently reached by interurban lines, there were still drawbacks, and the principal of these related to the attitude of both Roberta and Clyde in regard to this room, and what, if any, use of it was to be made by them jointly. For in spite of the fact that thus far Clyde had never openly agreed with himself that his intentions in relation to Roberta were in any way different to those normally entertained by any youth toward any girl for whom he had a conventional social regard, still, now that she'd moved into this room, there was that ineradicable and possibly sensible, yet very human and almost unescapable desire for something more, the possibility of greater and greater intimacy with and control of Roberta and her thoughts and actions in everything, so that in the end she would be entirely his. But how his? By way of marriage and the ordinary conventional and durable existence which thereafter must ordinarily ensue? He had never said so to himself thus far, for in flirting with her or any girl of a lesser social position than that of the Griffiths here, Sandra Finchley, Bertine Cranston, for instance, he would not, and that largely due to the attitude of his newly found relatives, their very high position in the city, have deemed marriage advisable. And what would they think if they should come to know? For socially, as he saw himself now, if not before coming here, he was supposed to be above the type of Roberta, and should of course profit by that notion. Besides, there were all those that knew him here, at least to speak to. On the other hand, because of the very marked pull that her temperament had for him, he'd not been able to say for the time being that she was not worthy of him, or that he might not be happy in case it were possible or advisable for him to marry her. And there was another thing now that tended to complicate matters, and that was that fall, with its chilling winds and frosty nights, was drawing near. Already it was near October 1st, and most of those outdoor resorts which, up to the middle of September at least, had provided diversion, and that at a fairly safe distance from Lycurgus, were already closed for the season, and dancing, except in the halls of the nearby cities, and which, because of a mood of hers in regard to them, were unacceptable, was also for the time being done away with. As for the churches, moving pictures, and restaurants of Lycurgus, how, under the circumstances, owing to Clyde's position here, could they be seen in them? They could not, as both reasoned between them, and so now, while her movements were unrestrained, there was no place to go unless by some readjustment of their relations he might be permitted to call on her at the Gilpins. But that, as he knew, she would not think of, and at first neither had he the courage to suggest it. However, they were at a street end one early October night about 6 weeks after she'd moved to her new room. The stars were sharp, the air cool, the leaves were beginning to turn. Roberta had returned to a 3/4 green and cream striped winter coat that she wore at this season of the year. Her hat was brown, trimmed with brown leather, and of a design that became her. There had been kisses over and over, that same fever that had been dominating them continuously since first they met, only more pronounced, if anything. "It's getting cold, isn't it?" It was Clyde who spoke, and it was 11 o'clock and chill. "Yes, I should say it is. I'll soon have to get a heavier coat." "I don't see how we are to do from now on, do you? There's no place to go any more much, and it won't be very pleasant walking the streets this way every night. You don't suppose we could fix it so I could call on you at the Gilpins once in a while, do you? It isn't the same there now as it was at the Newtons." "Oh, I know. But then they use their sitting room every night nearly until 10:30 or 11. And besides, their 2 girls are in and out all hours up to 12 anyhow. And they're in there often. I don't see how I can. Besides, I thought you said you didn't want to have anyone see you with me that way. And if you came there, I couldn't help introducing you." "Oh, but I don't mean just that way," replied Clyde audaciously, and yet with the feeling that Roberta was much too squeamish, and that it was high time she was taking a somewhat more liberal attitude toward him if she cared for him as much as she appeared to. "Why, wouldn't it be all right for me to stop in for a little while? They wouldn't need to know, would they?" He took out his watch and discovered with the aid of a match that it was 11:30. He showed the time to her. "There wouldn't be anybody there now, would there?" She shook her head in opposition. The thought not only terrified but sickened her. Clyde was getting very bold to even suggest anything like that. Besides, the suggestion embodied in itself All the secret fears and compelling moods which hitherto, although actual in herself, she was still unwilling to face. There was something sinful, low, dreadful about it. She would not. That was one thing sure. At the same time within her was that overmastering urge of repressed and feared desire, now knocking loudly for recognition. No, I can't let you do that. It wouldn't be right. I don't want to. Someone might see us. Somebody might know you. For the moment the moral repulsion was so great that unconsciously she endeavored to relinquish herself from his embrace. Clyde sensed how deep was his sudden revolt. All the more was he flagellated by the desire for possession of that which now he half feared to be unobtainable. A dozen seductive excuses sprang to his lips. Oh, who would be likely to see us anyhow at this time of night? There isn't anyone around. Why shouldn't we go there for a few moments if we want to? No one would be likely to hear us. We needn't talk so loud. There isn't anyone on the street even. Let's walk by the house and see if anybody's up. Since hitherto she'd not permitted him to come within half a block of the house, her protest was not only nervous but vigorous. Nevertheless, on this occasion, Clyde was proving a little rebellious, and Roberta, standing somewhat in awe of him as her superior, as well as her lover, was unable to prevent their walking within a few feet of the house where they stopped. Except for a barking dog, there was not a sound to be heard anywhere, and in the house no light was visible. "See, there's no one up," protested Clyde reassuringly. "Why shouldn't we go in for a little while if we want to? Who will know? We needn't make any noise. Besides, what's wrong with it? Other people do it. It isn't such a terrible thing for a girl to take a fellow to a room if she wants to for a little while." "Oh, isn't it? Well, maybe not in your set. But I know what's right, and I don't think that's right, and I won't do it." At once, as she said this, Roberta's heart gave a pained and weakening throb, for in saying so much she had exhibited more individuality and defiance than ever he had seen, or that she fancied herself capable of in connection with him. It terrified her not a little. Perhaps he would not like her so much now if she were going to talk like that. His mood darkened immediately. Why did she want to act so? She was too cautious, too afraid of anything that spelled a little life or pleasure. Other girls were not like that. Rita, those girls at the factory. She pretended to love him. She did not object to his holding her in his arms and kissing her under a tree at the end of the street. But when it came to anything slightly more private or intimate, she could not bring herself to agree. What kind of a girl was she, anyhow? What was the use of pursuing her? Was this to be another case of Hortense Briggs with all her wiles and evasions? Of course Roberta was in no wise like her, but still she was so stubborn. Although she could not see his face, she knew he was angry, and quite for the first time in this way. "All right, then. If you don't want to, you don't have to," came his words, and with decidedly a cold ring to them. "There are other places I can go. I notice you never want to do anything I want to do, though. I'd like to know how you think we're to do. We can't walk the streets every night." His tone was gloomy and foreboding, more contentious and bitter than at any time ever between them, and his references to other places shocked and frightened Roberta, so much so that instantly almost her own mood changed. Those other girls in his own world that no doubt he saw from time to time, those other girls at the factory who were always trying to make eyes at him, she'd seen them trying, and often. That Rosa Nikiforovich, as coarse as she was, but pretty too, and that Flora Brandt, and Martha Bordelou. Ugh! To think that anyone as nice as he should be pursued by such wretches as those. However, because of that, she was fearful lest he would think her too difficult, someone without the experience or daring to which he in his superior world was accustomed, and so turned to one of those. Then she would lose him. The thought terrified her. Immediately from one of defiance, her attitude changed to one of pleading persuasion. "Oh, please, Clyde, don't be mad with me now, will you? You know that I would if I could. I can't do anything like that here. Can't you see? You know that. Why, they'd be sure to find out. And how would you feel if someone were to see us or recognize you?" In a pleading way she put one hand on his arm, then about his waist, and he could feel that in spite of her sharp opposition the moment before, she was very much concerned, painfully so. "Please don't ask me to," she added in a begging tone. "Well, what did you want to leave the Newtons for, then?" he asked sullenly. I can't see where else we can go now, if you won't let me come to see you once in a while. We can't go any place else." The thought gave Roberta pause. Plainly, this relationship was not to be held within conventional lines. At the same time, she did not see how she could possibly comply. It was too unconventional, too unmoral, bad. "I thought we took it," she said weakly and placatively, "just so that we could go places on Saturday and Sunday." "But where can we go Saturday and Sunday now? Everything's closed." Again Roberta was checked by these unanswerable complexities which beleaguered them both, and she exclaimed futilely, "Oh, I wish I knew what to do." "Oh, it would be easy enough if you wanted to do it, but that's always the way with you. You don't want to." She stood there, the night wind shaking the drying, whispering leaves. Distinctly the problem in connection with him that she'd been fearing this long while was upon her. Could she possibly, with all the right instruction that she'd had, now do as he suggested? She was pulled and swayed by contending forces within herself, strong and urgent in either case. In the one instance, however painful it was to her moral and social mood, she was moved to comply. In another, to reject once and for all any such, as she saw it, bold and unnatural suggestion. Nevertheless, in spite of the latter and because of her compelling affection, she could not do other than deal tenderly and pleadingly with him. "I can't, Clyde. I can't. I would if I could, but I can't. It wouldn't be right. I would if I could make myself, but I can't." She looked up into his face, a pale oval in the dark, trying to see if he would not see, sympathize, be moved in her favor. However, irritated by this plainly definite refusal, he was not now to be moved. All this, as he saw it, smacked of that long series of defeats which had accompanied his attentions to Hortense Breeks. He was not going to stand for anything now like that, you bet. If this was the way she was going to act, well, let her act so, but not with him. He could get plenty of girls now, lots of them, who would treat him better than this. At once, and with an irritated shrug of the shoulders, as she now saw, he turned and started to leave her, saying as he did so, "Oh, that's all right, if that's the way you feel about it." And Roberta, dumbfounded and terrified, stood there. "Please don't go, Clyde. Please don't leave me," she exclaimed suddenly and pathetically, her defiance and courage undergoing a deep and sad change. "I don't want you to. I love you so, Clyde. I would if I could, you know that." "Oh, yes, I know. But you needn't tell me that. It was his experience with Hortense and Rita that was prompting him to this attitude." With a twist he released his body from her arm and started walking briskly down the street in the dark. And Roberta, stricken by this sudden development, which was so painful to both, called, "Clyde!" and then ran after him a little way, eager that he should pause and let her plead with him more. But he did not return. Instead he went briskly on, and for the moment it was all that she could do to keep from following him, and by sheer force, if need be, restrain him. Her Clyde. And she started running in his direction a little, but as suddenly stopped, checked for the moment by the begging, pleading, compromising attitude in which she for the first time found herself. For on the one hand, all her conventional training was now urging her to stand firm, not to belittle herself in this way, whereas on the other, all her desires for love, understanding, companionship urged her to run after him before it was too late, and he was gone. His beautiful face, his beautiful hands, his eyes, and still the receding echo of his feet, and yet so binding were the conventions which had been urged upon her up to this time that, though suffering horribly, a balance between the two forces was struck, and she paused, feeling that she could neither go forward nor stand still, understand or endure this sudden rift in their wonderful friendship. Pain constricted her heart and whitened her lips. She stood there numb and silent, unable to voice anything, even the name Clyde, which persistently arose as a call in her throat. Instead, she was merely thinking, "Oh, Clyde, please don't go, Clyde. Oh, please don't go." And he was already out of hearing, walking briskly and grimly on, the click and echo of his receding steps falling less and less clearly on her suffering ears. It was the first flashing, blinding, bleeding stab of love for her. Chapter 21. The state of Roberta's mind for that night is not easily to be described, for here was true and poignant love, and in youth true and poignant love is difficult to withstand. Besides, it was coupled with the most stirring and grandiose allusions in regard to Clyde's local material and social condition, allusions which had little to do with anything he'd done to build up, but were based rather on conjecture and gossip over which he had no control. And her own home, as well as her personal situation, was so unfortunate. No promise of any kind save in his direction. And here she was quarrelling with him, sending him away angry. On the other hand, was he not beginning to push too ardently toward those troublesome and no doubt dreadful liberties and familiarities which her morally trained conscience would not permit her to look upon as right? How was she to do now? What to say? Now it was that she said to herself in the dark of her room, after having slowly and thoughtfully undressed and noiselessly crept into the large old-fashioned bed, "No, I won't do that. I mustn't. I can't. I'll be a bad girl if I do. I should not do that for him, even though he does want me to, and should threaten to leave me forever in case I refuse. He should be ashamed to ask me." And at the very same moment of the next, she would be asking herself what else under the circumstances they were to do. For most certainly Clyde was at least partially correct in his contention that they had scarcely anywhere else they could go and not be recognized. How unfair was that rule of the company! And no doubt apart from that rule, the Griffiths would think it beneath him to be troubling with her, as would no doubt the Newtons and the Gilpins, for that matter, if they should hear and know who he was. And if this information came to their knowledge, it would injure him and her, and she would not do anything that would injure him, never. One thing that occurred to her at this point was that she should get a place somewhere else so that this problem should be solved, a problem which at the moment seemed to have little to do with a more immediate and intimate one of desiring to enter a room, but that would mean that she would not see him any more all day long, only at night, and then not every night by any means, and that caused her to lay aside this thought of seeking another place. At the same time as she now meditated, the dawn would come tomorrow, and there would be Clyde at the factory, and supposing that he should not speak to her, nor she to him. Impossible, ridiculous, terrible. The mere thought brought her to a sitting posture in bed, where distractedly a vision of Clyde looking indifferently and coldly upon her came to her. On the instant she was on her feet, and had turned on the one incandescent globe which dangled from the center of the room. She went to the mirror, hanging above the old walnut dresser in the corner, and stared at herself. Already she imagined she could see dark rings under her eyes. She felt numb and cold, and now shook her head in a helpless and distracted way. He couldn't be that mean. He couldn't be that cruel to her now, could he? Oh, if he knew but how difficult, how impossible was the thing he was asking of her. Oh, if the day would only come so that she could see his face again. Oh, if it were only another night, so that she could take his hands in hers, his arm, feel his arms about her. "Clyde, Clyde," she exclaimed half aloud, "you wouldn't do that to me, would you? You couldn't." She crossed to an old, faded, and somewhat decrepit, overstuffed chair, which stood in the center of the room beside a small table, whereon lay some nondescript books and magazines. The Saturday Evening Post, Munsey's, the Popular Science Monthly, Beebe's Garden Seeds, and to escape most distracting and searing thoughts sat down, her chin in her hands, her elbows planted on her knees. But the painful thoughts continuing, and a sense of chill overtaking her, she took a comforter off the bed and folded it about her, then opened the seed catalogue, only to throw it down. "No, no, no! He couldn't do that to me! He wouldn't!" She must not let him. Why, he told her over and over that he was crazy about her, madly in love with her. They'd been to all these wonderful places together. And now, without any real consciousness of her movements, she was moving from the chair to the edge of the bed, sitting with elbows on knees and chin in hands. Or she was before the mirror, or peering restlessly out into the dark to see if there were any trace of day. And at 6 and 6:30, when the light was just breaking and it was nearing time to dress, she was still up, in the chair, on the edge of the bed, in the corner before the mirror. But she'd reached but one definite conclusion, and that was that in some way she must arrange not to have Clyde leave her. That must not be. There must be something that she could say or do that would cause him to love her still, even if she must let him stop in here or somewhere from time to time, some other room in some other rooming house maybe, where she could arrange in some way beforehand, say that he was her brother or something. But the mood that dominated Clyde was of a different nature. To have understood it correctly, the full measure and obstinacy and sullen contentiousness that had suddenly generated, one would have had to return to Kansas City and the period in which he had been so futilely dancing attendance upon Hortense Briggs. Also his having been compelled to give up Rita, yet to no end. For although the present conditions and situation were different, and he had no moral authority wherewith to charge Roberta with any such unfair treatment as Hortense had meted out to him, still there was this other fact that girls, all of them, were obviously stubborn and self-preservative, always setting themselves apart and even above the average man, and so wishing to compel him to do a lot of things for them without their wishing to do anything in return. And had not Ratterer always told him that insofar as girls were concerned, he was more or less of a fool, too easy, too eager to show his hand and let them know that he was struck on them? Whereas, as Ratterer had explained, Clyde possessed the looks, the goods, and why should he always be trailing after girls unless they wanted him very much? And this thought and compliment had impressed him very much at that time. Only because of the fiascos in connection with Hortense and Rita, he was more earnest now. Yet here he was again in danger of repeating or bringing upon himself what had befallen him in the case of Hortense and Rita. At the same time, he was not without the self-incriminating thought that in seeking this, most distinctly, he was driving toward a relationship which was not legitimate and that would prove dangerous in the future. For, as he now darkly and vaguely thought, if he sought a relationship which her prejudices and her training would not permit her to look upon as anything but evil, was he not thereby establishing in some form a claim on her part to some consideration from him in the future which it might not be so easy for him to ignore? For after all he was the aggressor, not she, and because of this and whatever might follow in connection with it, might not she be in a position to demand more from him than he might be willing to give? For was it his intention to marry her? In the back of his mind there lurked something which even now assured him that he would never desire to marry her, could not in the face of his high family connections here. Therefore should he proceed to demand, or should he not? And if he did, could he avoid that which would preclude any claim in the future? He did not thus so distinctly voice his inmost feelings to himself, but relatively if such was their nature. Yet so great was the temperamental and physical enticement of Roberta that in spite of a warning nudge or mood that seemed to hint that it was dangerous for him to persist in his demand, he kept saying to himself that unless she would permit him to her room, he would not have anything more to do with her, the desire for her being all but overpowering. This contest which every primary union between the sexes, whether with or without marriage, implies, was fought out the next day in the factory, and yet without a word on either side, for Clyde, though he considered himself to be deeply in love with Roberta, was still not so deeply involved but that a naturally selfish and ambitious and seeking disposition would in this instance stand its ground and master any impulse, and he was determined to take the attitude of one who had been injured, and was determined not to be friends any more or yield in any way unless some concession on her part, such as would appease him, was made. And in consequence he came into the stamping department that morning with the face and the air of one who was vastly preoccupied with matters which had little, if anything, to do with what had occurred the night before. Yet being far from certain that this attitude on his part was likely to lead to anything but defeat, he was inwardly depressed and awry. For after all, the sight of Roberta, freshly arrived, and although pale and distrait, as charming and energetic as ever, was not calculated to assure him of any immediate or even ultimate victory, and knowing her as well as he thought he did by now, he was but weakly sustained by the thought that she might yield. He looked at her repeatedly when she was not looking, and when in turn she looked at him repeatedly, but only at first when he was not looking, later when she felt satisfied that his eyes, whether directly bent on her or not, must be encompassing her, still no trace of recognition could she extract. And now, to her bitter disappointment, not only did he choose to ignore her, but quite for the first time since they'd been so interested in each other, he professed to pay, if not exactly conspicuous, at least noticeable and intentional attention, to those other girls who were always so interested in him, and who always, as she'd been constantly imagining, were but waiting for any slight overture on his part to yield themselves to him in any way that he might dictate. Now he is looking over the shoulder of Ruza Nokovorich, her plump face with its snub nose and weak chin turned engagingly toward him, and he commenting on something not particularly connected with the work in hand. Apparently, for both were idly smiling. Again, in a little while, he was by the side of Martha Portaloo, her plump French shoulders and arms bare to the pits next to his, and for all her fleshy solidity and decidedly foreign flavor, there was still enough about her which most men would like. And with her Clyde was attempting to jest, too. And later was Flora Brant, the very sensuous and not unpleasing American girl whom Roberta had seen Clyde cultivating from time to time. Yet even so she'd never been willing to believe that he might become interested in any of these. Not Clyde, surely. And yet he could not see her at all now, could not find time to say a single word, although all these pleasant words and gay looks for all these others. Oh, how bitter! Oh, how cruel! And how utterly she despised those other girls with their oglings and their open attempts to take him from her. Oh, how terrible! Surely he must be very opposed to her now, otherwise he could not do this, and especially after all that had been between them, the love, the kisses. The hours dragged for both, and with as much poignance for Clyde as for Roberta. For his was a feverish, urgent disposition where his dreams were concerned, and could ill brook the delay or disappointments that are the chief and outstanding characteristics of the ambitions of men, whatever their nature. He was tortured hourly by the thought that he was to lose Roberta, or that to win her back he would have to succumb to her wishes. And on her part she was torn, not so much by the question as to whether she would have to yield in this matter, for by now that was almost the least of her worries, but whether once so yielding, Clyde would be satisfied with just some form of guarded social contact in the room or not, and so continue on the strength of that to be friends with her. For more than this she would not grant, never. And yet, this suspense, the misery of his indifference, she could scarcely endure it from minute to minute, let alone from hour to hour, and finally, in an agony of dissatisfaction with herself at having brought all this on herself, she retired to the rest-room at about 3 in the afternoon, and there, with the aid of a piece of paper found on the floor and a small bit of pencil which she had, she composed a brief note. "Please, Clyde, don't be mad at me, will you? Please don't. Please look at me and speak to me, won't you? I'm so sorry about last night, really I am, terribly. And I must see you tonight at the end of Elm Street at 8:30 if you can. Will you? I've something to tell you. Please do come. And please do look at me and tell me you will, even though you're angry. You won't be sorry. I love you so. You know I do. Your sorrowful Roberta." And in the spirit of one who is in agonized search for an opiate, she folded up the paper and, returning to the room, drew close to Clyde's desk. He was before it at the time, bent over some slips, and quickly as she passed she dropped the paper between his hands. He looked up instantly, his dark eyes still hard at the moment with the mingled pain and unrest and dissatisfaction and determination that had been upon him all day, and noting Roberta's retreating figure as well as the note, he at once relaxed. A wave of puzzled satisfaction as well as delight instantly filled them. He opened it and read, and as instantly his body was suffused with a warm and yet very weakening ray. And Roberta, in turn, having reached her table and paused to note if by any chance anyone had observed her, now looked cautiously about, a strained and nervous look in her eyes. But seeing Clyde looking directly at her, his eyes filled with a conquering and yet a yielding light, and a smile upon his lips, and his head nodding a happy assent, she as suddenly experienced a dizzying sensation, as though her hitherto constricted blood, detained by a constricted heart and constricted nerves, were as suddenly set free, and all the dry marshes and cracked and parched banks of her soul, the dry rivulets and streams and lakes of misery that seemed to dot her being, were as instantly flooded with this rich upwelling force of life and love. And a cassette number 8, side 1. To continue, please turn the cassette over. Cassette number 8, side 2 of An American Tragedy. Clyde would meet her. They would meet tonight. He would put his arms around her and kiss her as before. She'd be able to look in his eyes. They would not quarrel any more. Oh, never, if she could help it. Chapter 22. The wonder and delight of a new and more intimate form of contact, of protest gainsayed, of scruples overcome, days when both, having struggled in vain against the greater intimacy which each knew that the other was desirous of yielding to, and eventually so yielding, looked forward to the approaching night with an eagerness which was as a fever embodying a fear. For with what qualms, what protests on the part of Roberta, what determination, yet not without a sense of evil, seduction, betrayal on the part of Clyde. Yet the thing once done, a wild, convulsive pleasure motivating both, yet not without, before all this, an exaction on the part of Roberta to the effect that never, come what might, the natural consequences of so wild an intimacy strong in her thoughts, would he desert her, since without his aid she would be helpless, yet with no direct statement as to marriage, and he so completely overcome and swayed by his desire, thoughtlessly protesting that he never would, never. She might depend on that at least, although even then there was no thought in his mind of marriage. He would not do that, yet nights and nights, all scruples for the time being abandoned, and however much by day Roberta might brood and condemn herself, when each yielded to the other completely, and dreamed thereafter recklessly and wildly of the joy of it, wishing from day to day for the time being that the long day might end, that the concealing, rewarding, feverish night were at hand, and Clyde feeling, and not unlike Roberta, who was firmly and even painfully convinced of it, that this was sin, deadly mortal, since both his mother and father had so often emphasized that, the seducer, adulterer, who prays outside the sacred precincts of marriage, and Roberta peering nervously into the blank future, wondering what, how, in any case, by any chance, Clyde should change or fail her. Yet the night returning, her mood once more veering, and she as well as he hurrying to meet somewhere, only later in the silence of the middle night to slip into this unlighted room, which was proving so much more of a paradise than either might ever know again. So wild and unrecapturable is the fever of youth. And at times, and despite all his other doubts and fears, Clyde, because of this sudden abandonment by Roberta of herself to his desires, feeling for the first time really in all his feverish years that at last he was a man of the world, one who was truly beginning to know women, and so taking to himself an air or manner that said as plainly as might have any words, "Behold, I am no longer the inexperienced, neglected simpleton of but a few weeks ago, but an individual of import now, someone who knows something about life. What have any of these strutting young men and gay, coaxing, flirting girls all about me that I've not? And if I chose, were less loyal than I am, what might I not do?" And this was proving to him that the notion which Hortense Briggs, to say nothing of the more recent fiasco in connection with Rita, had tended to build up in his mind, i.e., that he was either unsuccessful or ill-fated where girls were concerned, was false. He was, after all, and despite various failures and inhibitions, a youth of the Don Juan and Lothario stripe. And if now Roberta was obviously willing to sacrifice herself for him in this fashion, must there not be others? And this, in spite of the present indifference of the Griffiths, caused him to walk with even more of an air than had hitherto characterized him. Even though neither they nor any of those connected with them recognized him, still he looked at himself in his mirror from time to time with an assurance and admiration which before this he had never possessed. For now Roberta, feeling that her future was really dependent on his will and whim, had set herself to flatter him almost constantly, to be as obliging and convenient to him as possible. Indeed, according to her notion of the proper order of life, she was now his and his only, as much as any wife is ever to a husband, to do with as he wished. And for a time, therefore, Clyde forgot his rather neglected state here, and was content to devote himself to her without thinking much of the future. The one thing that did trouble him at times was the thought that possibly, in connection with the original fear she had expressed to him, something might go wrong, which, considering her exclusive devotion to him, might prove embarrassing. At the same time, he did not trouble to speculate too deeply as to that. He had Roberta now. These relations, in so far as either of them could see or guess, were a dark secret. The pleasures of this left-handed honeymoon were at full tide, and the remaining brisk and often sunshiny and warm November and first December days passed, as in a dream really, an ecstatic paradise of sorts in the very center of a humdrum, conventional and petty and underpaid workaday world. In the meantime, the Griffiths had been away from the city since the middle of June, and ever since their departure, Clyde had been meditating upon them, and all they represented in his life and that of the city. Their great house closed and silent, except for gardeners and an occasional chauffeur or servant visible as he walked from time to time past the place, was the same as a shrine to him, nearly, the symbol of that height to which by some turn of fate he might still hope to attain. For he had never quite been able to expel from his mind the thought that his future must in some way be identified with the grandeur that was here laid out before him. Yet, so far as the movements of the Griffiths family and their social peers outside Lycurgus were concerned, he knew little, other than that which from time to time he read in the society columns of the two local papers, which almost obsequiously pictured the comings and goings of all those who were connected with the more important families of the city. At times, after reading these accounts, he'd picture to himself, even when he was off somewhere, with Roberta at some unheralded resort, Gilbert Griffiths racing in his big car, Bella, Bertine, and Sandra dancing, canoeing in the moonlight, playing tennis, riding at some of the smart resorts where they were reported to be. The thing had had a bite and ache for him that was almost unendurable, and had lit up for him at times, and with overwhelming clarity, this connection of his with Roberta. For after all, who was she? A factory girl, the daughter of parents who lived and worked on a farm, and one who was compelled to work for her own living. Whereas he, if fortune would but favor him a little, was this to be the end of all his dreams in connection with his prospective superior life here? So it was that at moments and in his darker moods, and especially after she had abandoned herself to him, his thoughts ran. She was not of his station, really, at least not of that of the Griffiths, to which he still most eagerly aspired. Yet at the same time, whatever the mood generated by such items as he read in the Star, he would still return to Roberta, picturing her, since the other mood which had drawn him to her had by no means palled as yet, as delightful, precious, exceedingly worthwhile from the point of view of beauty, pleasure, sweetness, the attributes and charms which best identify any object of delight. But the Griffiths and their friends having returned to the city, and Lycurgus once more taken on that brisk industrial and social mood, which invariably characterized it for at least 7 months in the year, he was again, and even more vigorously than before, intrigued by it. The beauty of the various houses along Waikiki Avenue and its immediate tributaries, the unusual and intriguing sense of movement and life there so much in evidence. Oh, if he were but of it! Chapter 23. And then one November evening, as Clyde was walking along Waikiki Avenue, just west of Central, a portion of the locally celebrated avenue which, ever since he'd moved to Mrs. Peyton's, he was accustomed to traverse to and from his work, one thing did occur which, insofar as he and the Griffiths were concerned, was destined to bring about a chain of events which none of them could possibly have foreseen. At that time there was in his heart and mind that singing which is the inheritance of youth and ambition, and which the dying of the old year, instead of depressing, seemed but to emphasize. He had a good position. He was respected here. Over and above his room and board, he had not less than $15 a week to spend on himself and Roberta, an income which, while it did not parallel that which had been derived from the Green Davidson of the Union League, was still not so involved with family miseries in the one place or personal loneliness in the other. And he had Roberta secretly devoted to him, and the Griffiths, thank goodness, did not and should not know anything of that, though just how, in case of a difficulty, was to be avoided, he was not even troubling to think. His was a disposition which did not tend to load itself with more than the most immediate cares, and although the Griffiths and their friends had not chosen to recognize him socially, still more and more all others who were not connected with local society and who knew of him did. Only this very day, because the spring before he'd been made a room chief, perhaps, and Samuel Griffiths had recently paused and talked with him, no less an important personage than Mr. Rudolph Smiley, one of the several active vice-presidents, had asked him most cordially and casually whether he played golf, and if so, when spring came again, whether he might not be interested to join the Amiskig, one of the two really important golf clubs within a half a dozen miles of the city. Now what could that mean, if not that Mr. Smiley was beginning to see him as a social possibility, and that he, as well as many others about the factory, were becoming aware of him as someone who was of some importance to the Griffiths, if not the factory? This thought, together with one other, that once more after dinner he was to see Roberta and in her room as early as 11 o'clock or even earlier, cheered him and caused him to step along most briskly and gaily. For since having indulged in this secret adventure so many times, both were unconsciously becoming bolder. Not having been detected to date, they were of the notion that it was possible they might not be, or if they were, Clyde might be introduced as her brother or cousin for the moment, anyhow, in order to avoid immediate scandal. Later, to avoid danger of comment or subsequent detection, as both had agreed after some discussion, Roberta might have to move to some other place where the same routine was to be repeated. But that would be easy, or at least better than no freedom of contact, and with that Roberta had been compelled to agree. However, on this occasion there came a contact and an interruption which set his thoughts careening in an entirely different direction. Reaching the first of the more important houses of Waikiki Avenue, although he had not the slightest idea who lived there, he was gazing interestedly at the high wrought-iron fence, as well as the well-kept lawn within, dimly illuminated by street lamps, and upon the surface of which he could detect many heaps of freshly fallen brown leaves being shaken and rolled by a winnowing and gambling wind. It was all so starkly severe, placid, reserved, beautiful as he saw it, that he was quite stirred by the dignity and richness of it, and as he neared the central gate, above which 2 lights were burning, making a circle of light about it, a close car of great size and solidity stopped directly in front of it, and the chauffeur stepping down and opening the door, Clyde instantly recognized Sandra Finchley leaning forward in the car. "Go round to the side entrance, David, and tell Miriam that I can't wait for her, because I'm going over to the Trumbles for dinner, and that I'll be back by 9. If she's not there, leave this note and hurry, will you?" The voice and manner were of that imperious and yet pleasing mode which had so intrigued him the spring before. At the same time seeing, as she thought, Gilbert Griffiths approaching along the sidewalk, she called, "Oh, hello! Walking tonight? If you want to wait a minute, you can ride out with me. I've just sent David in with a note. He won't be long." Now Sandra Finchley, despite the fact that she was interested in Bella and the Griffiths' wealth and prestige in general, was by no means as well pleased with Gilbert. He'd been indifferent to her in the beginning, when she tried to cultivate him, and he had remained so. He had wounded her pride, and to her, who was overflowing with vanity and self-conceit, this was the last offence, and she could not forgive him. She could not and would not brook the slightest trace of ego in another, and most especially the vain, cold, self-centered person of Bella's brother. He had too fine an opinion of himself, as she saw it, was one who was too bursting with vanity to be of service to anyone. That stick! It was so that she invariably thought of him. Who does he think he is, anyhow? He certainly does think he's a lot around here. You'd think he was a Rockefeller or a Morgan, and for my part I can't see where he's a bit interesting any more. I like Bella. I think she's lovely. But that smarty, I guess he would like to have a girl wait on him. Well, not for me. Such in the main were the comments made by Sandra upon such reported acts and words of Gilbert as were brought to her by others. And for his part Gilbert, hearing of the gyrations, airs, and aspirations of Sandra from Bella from time to time, was accustomed to remark, "Why, that little snip! Who does she think she is, anyhow? If ever there was a conceited little nut!" However, so tightly were the social lines of Lycurgus drawn, so few the truly eligibles, that it was almost necessary and compulsory upon those in to make the best of such others as were in. And so it was that she now greeted Gilbert, as she thought, and as she moved over slightly from the door to make room for him, Clyde, almost petrified by this unexpected recognition, and quite shaken out of his pose and self-contemplation, not being sure whether he'd heard aright, now approached, his manner the epitome almost of a self-ingratiating and somewhat affectionate and wistful dog of high breeding and fine temperament. "Oh, good evening," he exclaimed, removing his cap and bowing. "How are you?" While his mind was registering that this truly was the beautiful, the exquisite Sandra, who months before he'd met at his uncle's, and concerning whose social activities during the preceding summer he'd been reading in the papers. And now here she was, as lovely as ever, seated in this beautiful car, and addressing him apparently. However, Sandra, on the instant realizing that she'd made a mistake and that it was not Gilbert, was quite embarrassed and uncertain for the moment just how to extricate herself from a situation which was a bit ticklish, to say the least. "Oh, pardon me. You're Mr. Clyde Griffiths, I see now. It's my mistake. I thought you were Gilbert. I couldn't quite make you out in the light." She had for the moment an embarrassed and fidgety and halting manner, which Clyde noticed, and which he saw implied that she'd made a mistake that was not entirely flattering to him nor satisfactory to her, and this in turn caused him to become confused and anxious to retire. "Oh, pardon me, but that's all right. I didn't mean to intrude. I thought—" He flushed and stepped back, really troubled. But now Sandra, seeing at once that Clyde was, if anything, much more attractive than his cousin and far more diffident, and obviously greatly impressed by her charms as well as her social state, unbent sufficiently to say with a charming smile, "But that's all right. Won't you get in, please, and let me take you where you're going? Oh, I wish you would. I'll be so glad to take you." For there was that in Clyde's manner, the instant he learned that it was due to a mistake that he'd been recognized, which caused even her to understand that he was hurt, abashed, and disappointed. His eyes took on a hurt look, and there was a wavering, apologetic, sorrowful smile playing about his lips. "Why, yes, of course," he said jerkily. "That is, if you want me to. I understand how it was. That's all right. But you needn't mind if you don't wish to. I thought—" He'd half turned to go, but was so drawn by her that he could scarcely tear himself away before she repeated, "Oh, do come. Get in, Mr. Griffiths. I'll be so glad if you will. It won't take David a moment to take you wherever you're going, I'm sure. And I'm sorry about the other, really I am. I didn't mean, you know, that just because you weren't Gilbert Griffiths." He paused, and in a bewildered manner stepped forward, and entering the car, slipped into the seat beside her. And she, interested by his personality, at once began to look at him, feeling glad that it was he now instead of Gilbert. In order the better to see and again reveal her devastating charms as she saw them to Clyde, she'd now switched on the roof light, and the chauffeur returning, she asked Clyde where he wished to go, an address which he gave reluctantly enough, since it was so different from the street in which she resided. As the car sped on, he was animated by a feverish desire to make some use of this brief occasion which might cause her to think favorably of him, perhaps, who knows, lead to some faint desire on her part to contact him again at some time or other. He was so truly eager to be of her world. "It's certainly nice of you to take me up this way," he now turned to her and observed, smiling. "I didn't think it was my cousin you meant, or I wouldn't have come up as I did." "Oh, that's all right. Don't mention it," replied Sandra, archly, with a kind of sticky sweetness in her voice. Her original impression of him, as she now felt, had been by no means so vivid. "It's my mistake, not yours. But I'm glad I made it now, anyhow," she added most definitely, and with an engaging smile. "I think I'd rather pick you up than I would Gil, anyhow. We don't get along any too well, he and I. We quarrel a lot whenever we do meet anywhere." She smiled, having completely recovered from her momentary embarrassment, and now leaned back after the best princess fashion, her glance examining Clyde's very regular features with interest. He had such soft, smiling eyes, she thought. And after all, as she now reasoned, he was Bella and Gilbert's cousin, and looked prosperous. "Well, that's too bad," he said stiffly, and with a very awkward and weak attempt at being self-confident and even high-spirited in her presence. "Oh, it doesn't amount to anything, really. We just quarrel, that's all, once in a while." She saw that he was nervous and bashful and decidedly unresourceful in her presence, and it pleased her to think that she could thus befuddle and embarrass him so much. "Are you still working for your uncle?" "Oh, yes," replied Clyde quickly, as though it would make an enormous difference to her if he were not. "I have charge of a department over there now." "Oh, really? I didn't know. I haven't seen you at all since that one time, you know. You don't get time to go about much, I suppose." She looked at him wisely, as much as to say, "Your relatives aren't so very much interested in you." But really liking him now, she said instead, "You've been in the city all summer, I suppose?" "Oh, yes," replied Clyde, quite simply and winningly. "I have to be, you know. It's the work that keeps me here. But I've seen your name in the papers often, and read about your riding and tennis contests, and I saw you in that flower parade last June, too. I certainly thought you looked beautiful, like an angel almost." There was an admiring, pleading light in his eyes which now quite charmed her. What a pleasing young man, so different to Gilbert, and to think he should be so plainly and hopelessly smitten. and when she could take no more than a passing interest in him, it made her feel sorry a little, and hence kindly toward him. Besides, what would Gilbert think if he only knew that his cousin was so completely reduced by her? How angry he would be, he who so plainly thought her a snip. It would serve him just right if Clyde were taken up by someone and made more of than he, Gilbert, ever could hope to be. The thought had a most pleasing tang for her. However, at this point, unfortunately, the car turned in before Mrs. Peyton's door and stopped. The adventure for Clyde and for her was seemingly over. "That's awfully nice of you to say that. I won't forget that." She smiled archly as the chauffeur, opening the door, Clyde stepped down, his own nerves taut because of the grandeur and import of this encounter. "So this is where you live. Do you expect to be in Lycurgus all winter?" "Oh, yes, I'm quite sure of it. I hope to be, anyhow," he added quite yearningly, his eyes expressing his meaning completely. "Well, perhaps then I'll see you again somewhere sometime." "I hope so, anyhow." She nodded and gave him her fingers, and the most fetching and wreathy of smiles, and he, eager to the point of folly, added, "Oh, so do I." "Good night, good night," she called as the car sprang away, and Clyde, looking after it, wondered if he would ever see her again so closely and intimately as here. To think that he should have met her again in this way, and she had proved so very different from that first time, when, as he distinctly remembered, she took no interest in him at all. He turned hopefully and a little wistfully toward his own door. And Sandra, why was it, she pondered, as the motor car sped on its way, that the Griffiths were apparently not much interested in him? Chapter 24. The effect of this so casual contact was really disrupting in more senses than one, for now, in spite of his comfort in and satisfaction with Roberta, once more, and in this positive and to him entrancing way, was posed the whole question of his social possibilities here, and that, strangely enough, by the one girl of this upper level who had most materialized and magnified for him the meaning of that upper level itself, the beautiful Sandra Finchley, her lovely face, smart clothes, gay and superior demeanor. If only at the time he had first encountered her he had managed to interest her, or could now. The fact that his relations with Roberta were what they were now was not of sufficient import or weight to offset the temperamental or imaginative pull of such a girl as Sandra and all that she represented. Just to think the Wimblinger Finchley Electric Sweeper Company was one of the largest manufacturing concerns here. Its tall walls and stacks made a part of the striking skyline across the Mohawk, and the Finchley residence in Waikiki Avenue, near that of the Griffiths, was one of the most impressive among that distinguished row of houses which had come with the latest and most discriminating architectural taste here, Italian Renaissance, cream-hued marble and Dutchess County sandstone combined, and the Finchleys were among the most discussed of families here. Ah, to know this perfect girl more intimately, to be looked upon by her with favor, made by reason of that favor a part of that fine world to which he belonged. Was he not a Griffiths, as good-looking as Gilbert Griffiths any day, and as attractive if he only had as much money, or a part of it even, to be able to dress in the Gilbert Griffiths fashion, to ride around in one of the handsome cars he sported? Then you bet a girl like this would be delighted to notice him, mayhap, who knows, even fall in love with him. Annalshire, and the tray of glasses. But now, as he gloomily thought, he could only hope. The devil! He would not go around to Roberta's this evening. He would trump up some excuse, tell her in the morning that he had been called upon by his uncle or cousin to do some work. He could not and would not go, feeling as he did just now. So much for the effect of wealth, beauty, the peculiar social state to which he most aspired, on a temperament that was as fluid and unstable as water. On the other hand, later, thinking over her contact with Clyde, Sandra was definitely taken with what may only be described as his charm for her, all the more definite in this case, since it represented a direct opposite to all that his cousin offered by way of offense. His clothes and his manner, as well as a remark he dropped, to the effect that he was connected with the company in some official capacity, seemed to indicate that he might be better placed than she had imagined. Yet she also recalled that although she'd been about with Bella all summer and had encountered Gilbert, Myra, and their parents from time to time, there had never been a word about Clyde. Indeed, all the information she'd gathered concerning him was that originally furnished by Mrs. Griffiths, who had said that he was a poor nephew whom her husband had brought on from the West in order to help in some way. Yet now, as she viewed Clyde on this occasion, he did not seem so utterly unimportant or poverty-stricken by any means. Quite interesting, and rather smart and very attractive, and obviously anxious to be taken seriously by a girl like herself, as she could see. And this coming from Gilbert's cousin, a Griffiths, was flattering. Arriving at the Trumbles, a family which centered about one Douglas Trumbull, a prosperous lawyer and widower and speculator of this region, who, by reason of his children as well as his own good manners and legal subtlety, had managed to ingratiate himself into the best circles of Lycurgus society, she suddenly confided to Jill Trumbull, the elder of the lawyer's two daughters. "You know, I had a funny experience today." And she proceeded to relate all that had occurred in detail. Afterward, at dinner, Jill having appeared to find it most fascinating, she again repeated it to Gertrude and Tracy, the younger daughter and only son of the Trumbull family. "Oh, yes," observed Tracy Trumbull, a law student in his father's office. "I've seen that fellow, I bet 3 or 4 times on Central Avenue. He looks a lot like Gil, doesn't he? Only not so swagger. I've nodded to him 2 or 3 times this summer, because I thought he was Gil for the moment." "Oh, I've seen him too," commented Gertrude Trumbull. "He wears a cap and a belted coat like Gilbert Griffiths, sometimes, doesn't he? Arabella Stark pointed him out to me once, and then Jill and I saw him passing Stark's once on a Saturday afternoon. He's better looking than Gil any day, I think." This confirmed Sandra in her own thoughts in regard to Clyde, and now she added, "Bertine Cranston and I met him one evening last spring at the Griffiths. We thought he was too bashful then, but I wish you could see him now. He's positively handsome, with the softest eyes and the nicest smile." "Oh, now, Sandra," commented Jill Trumbull, who, apart from Bertine and Bella, was as close to Sandra as any girl here, having been one of her classmates in the Snedeker school. "I know someone who'd be jealous if he could hear you say that." "And wouldn't Gil Griffiths like to hear that his cousin's better looking than he is?" chimed in Tracy Trumbull. "Oh, say." "Oh, he," sniffed Sandra irritably. "He thinks he's so much. I'll bet anything it's because of him that the Griffiths won't have anything to do with their cousin. I'm sure of it, now that I think of it. Bella would, of course, because I heard her say last spring that she thought he was good-looking. And Myra wouldn't do anything to hurt anybody. What a lark if some of us were to take him up sometime and begin inviting him here and there, once in a while, you know, just for fun, to see how he would do, and how the Griffiths would take it. I know well enough it would be all right with Mr. Griffiths and Myra and Bella, but Gil, I'll bet, would be as peeved as anything. I couldn't do it myself very well, because I'm so close to Bella, but I know who could, and they couldn't say a thing." She paused, thinking of Bertine Cranston and how she disliked Gil and Mrs. Griffiths. "I wonder if he dances or rides or plays tennis or anything like that." She stopped and meditated amusedly, the while the others studied her, and Jill Trumbull, a restless, eager girl like herself, without so much of her looks or flair, however, observed, "It would be a prank, wouldn't it? Do you suppose the Griffiths really would dislike it very much?" "What's the difference if they did?" went on Sandra. "They couldn't do anything more than ignore him, could they? And who would care about that, I'd like to know? Not the people who invited him." "Go on, you fellows. Stir up a local scrap, will you?" put in Tracy Trumbull. "I'll bet anything that's what comes of it in the end. Gil Griffiths won't like it, you can gamble on that. I wouldn't if I were in his position. If you want to stir up a lot of feeling here, go to it, but I'll lay a bet that's what it comes to." Now Sandra Finchley's nature was of just such a turn that a thought of this kind was most appealing to her. However, as interesting as the idea was to her at the time, nothing definite might have come of it, had it not been that subsequent to this conversation and several others held with Bertine Cranston, Jill Trumbull, Patricia Anthony, and Arabella Stark, the news of this adventure, together with some comments as to himself, finally came to the ears of Gilbert Griffiths, yet only via Constance Wynant, to whom, as local gossip would have it, he was prospectively engaged, and Constance, hoping that Gilbert would marry her eventually, was herself irritated by the report that Sandra had chosen to interest herself in Clyde, and then, for no sane reason as she saw it, proclaimed that he was more attractive than Gilbert. So, as much to relieve herself as to lay some plan of avenging herself upon Sandra if possible, she conveyed the whole matter in turn to Gilbert, who at once proceeded to make various cutting references to Clyde and Sandra, and these carried back to Sandra, along with certain embellishments by Constance, had the desired effect. It served to awaken in her the keenest desire for retaliation. For if she chose, she certainly could be nice to Clyde and have others be nice to him too, and that would mean, perhaps, that Gilbert would find himself faced by a social rival of sorts, his own cousin, too, who, even though he was poor, might come to be liked better. What a lark! At the very same time there came to her a way by which she might most easily introduce Clyde, and yet without seeming so to do, and without any great harm to herself, if it did not terminate as she wished. For in Lycurgus, among the younger members of those smarter families whose children had been to the Snedeker school, existed a rather illusory and casual dinner and dance club called the Now and Then. It had no definite organization, officers, or abode. Anyone who, because of class and social connections, was eligible and chose to belong, could call a meeting of other members to give a dinner or dance or tea in their homes. And how simple, thought Sandra, in browsing around for a suitable vehicle by which to introduce Clyde, if someone other than herself who belonged could be induced to get up something, and then at her suggestion invite Clyde. How easy, say, for Jill Trumbull to give a dinner and dance to the Now and Thens, to which Clyde might be invited, and by this ruse she would thus be able to see him again and find out just how much he did interest her and what he was like. Accordingly, a small dinner for this club and its friends was announced for the first Thursday in December, Jill Trumbull to be the hostess. To it were to be invited Sandra and her brother, Stuart, Tracy, and Gertrude Trumbull, Arabella Stark, Bertine and her brother, and some others from Utica and Gloversville as well. And Clyde. But in order to safeguard Clyde against any chance of failure, or even invidious comment of any kind, not only she, but Bertine and Jill and Gertrude were to be attentive to and considerate of him. They were to see that his dance program was complete, and that neither at dinner nor on the dance floor was he to be left to himself, but was to be passed on most artfully from one to the other until evening should be over. For by reason of that, others might come to be interested in him, which would not only take the thorn from the thought that Sandra alone, of all the better people of Lycurgus, had been friendly to him, but would sharpen the point of this development for Gilbert, if not for Bella and the other members of the Griffiths family. And in accordance with this plan, so it was done, and so it was that Clyde, returning from the factory one early December evening about 2 weeks after his encounter with Sandra, was surprised by the sight of a cream-colored note leaning against the mirror of his dresser. It was addressed in a large, scrawly, and unfamiliar hand. He picked it up and turned it over, without being able in any way to fix upon the source. On the back were the initials B.T. or J.T., he could not decide which, so elaborately intertwined was the engraved penmanship. He tore it open and drew out a card which read, "The Now and Then Club will hold its first winter dinner dance at the home of Douglas Trumbull, 135 Waikiki Avenue, on Thursday, December 4. You are cordially invited. Will you kindly reply to Miss Jill Trumbull?" On the back of this, though, in the same scrawly hand that graced the envelope, was written, "Dear Mr. Griffiths, thought you might like to come. It'll be quite informal, and I'm quite sure you'll like it. If so, will you let Jill Trumbull know? Sandra Finchley." Quite amazed and thrilled, Clyde stood and stared, for ever since that second contact with her, he'd been more definitely fascinated than at any time before by the dream that somehow, in some way, he was to be lifted from the lowly state in which he now dwelt. He was, as he now saw it, really too good for the commonplace world by which he was environed. And now here was this, a social invitation issued by the Now and Then Club, of which, even though he'd never heard of it, must be something, since it was sponsored by such exceptional people, and on the back of it was there not the writing of Sandra herself? How marvelous, really! So astonished was he that he could scarcely contain himself for joy, but now on the instant must walk to and fro, looking at himself in the mirror, washing his hands and face, then deciding that his tie was not just right, perhaps, and changing to another, thinking forward to what he should wear, and back upon how Sandra had looked at him on that last occasion, and how she'd smiled, At the same time, he could not help wondering, even at this moment, of what Roberta would think if now, by some extra-optical power of observation, she could note his present joy in connection with his note. For plainly, and because he was no longer governed by the conventional notions of his parents, he had been allowing himself to drift into a position in regard to her which would certainly spell torture to her in case she should discover the nature of his present mood, a thought which puzzled him not a little, but did not serve to modify his thoughts in regard to Sandra in the least. That wonderful girl, that beauty, that world of wealth and social position she lived in. At the same time, so innately pagan and unconventional were his thoughts in regard to all this, that he could now ask himself, and that seriously enough, why should he not be allowed to direct his thoughts toward her and away from Roberta, since at the moment Sandra supplied the keener thought of delight? Roberta could not know about this. She could not see into his mind, could she, become aware of any such extra experience as this unless he told her? And most assuredly he did not intend to tell her. And what harm, he now asked himself, was there in a poor youth like himself aspiring to such heights? Other youths as poor as himself had married girls as rich as Sandra. For in spite of all that had occurred between him and Roberta, he had not, as he now clearly recalled, given her his word that he would marry her except under one condition, and such a condition, especially with the knowledge that he had all too clearly acquired in Kansas City, was not likely to happen as he thought. And Sandra, now that she had thus suddenly burst upon him again in this way, was the same as a fever to his fancy. This goddess in her shrine of gilt and tinsel, so utterly enticing to him, had deigned to remember him in this open and direct way, and to suggest that he be invited. And no doubt she herself was going to be there, a thought which thrilled him beyond measure. And what would not Gilbert and the Griffiths think if they were to hear of his going to this affair now, as they surely would, or meet him later at some other party to which Sandra might invite him? Think of that. Would it irritate or please them? Make them think less or more of him? For after all, this certainly was not of his doing. Was he not properly invited by people of their own station here in Lycurgus, whom most certainly they were compelled to respect? And by no device of his either, sheer accident, the facts concerning which would most certainly not reflect on him as pushing. As lacking as he was in some of the finer shades of mental discrimination, a sly and ironic pleasure lay in the thought that now Gilbert and the Griffiths might be compelled to countenance him whether they would or not, invite him to their home even. Or if these others did, how could they avoid it, really? Oh, joy! And that in the face of Gilbert's high contempt for him. He fairly chuckled as he thought of it, feeling that however much Gilbert might resent it, neither his uncle nor Myra were likely to, and that hence he would be fairly safe from any secret desire on the part of Gilbert to revenge himself on him for this. But how wonderful this invitation! Why, that intriguing scribble of Sandra's, unless she was interested in him some. Why? The thought was so thrilling that Clyde could scarcely eat his dinner that night. He took up the card and kissed the handwriting, and instead of going to see Roberta as usual, he decided as before, on first re-encountering her, to walk a bit, then return to his room and retire early, and on the morrow as before he could make some excuse, say that he had been over to the Griffiths' home, or some one of the heads of the factory, in order to listen to an explanation in regard to something in connection with the work, since there were often such conferences. For in the face of this, he did not care to see or talk to Roberta this night. He could not. The other thought, that of Sandra and her interest in him, was too enticing. Chapter 25. But in the interim, in connection with his relations with Roberta, no least reference to Sandra, although, even when nearer in the factory or a room, he could not keep his thoughts from wandering away to where Sandra, in her imaginary high social world, might be. The while Roberta, at moments only sensing a drift and remoteness in this thought and attitude, which had nothing to do with her, was wondering what it was that of late was beginning to occupy him so completely. And he, in his turn, when she was not looking, was thinking, supposing, since she troubled to recall herself to him, that he could interest a girl like Sandra in him. What, then, of Roberta? What? And in the face of this intimate relation that had now been established between them, goodness, the deuce! And that he did care for her, yes, he did, although now, basking in the direct rays of this newer luminary, He could scarcely see Roberta any longer, so strong were the actinic rays of this other. Was he all wrong? Was it evil to be like this? His mother would say so, and his father too, and perhaps everybody who thought right about life. Sandra Finchley, maybe, the Griffiths, all. And yet, it was snowing, the first light snow of the year, as Clyde arrayed in a new collapsible silk hat and white silk muffler, both suggested by a friendly haberdasher, Orange Short, with whom recently he had come in contact here, and a new silk umbrella wherewith to protect himself from the snow, made his way toward the very interesting, if not so very imposing, residence of the Trumbolls on Waikiki Avenue. It was quaint, low, and rambling, and the lights beaming from within upon the many drawn blinds gave it a Christmas card effect, and before it, even at the prompt hour at which he arrived, were ranged a half-dozen handsome cars of various builds and colors. The sight of them, sprinkled on tops, running boards, and fenders with a fresh, flaky snow, gave him a keen sense of a deficiency that was not likely soon to be remedied in his case, the want of ample means wherewith to equip himself with such a necessity as that. And inside, as he approached the door, he could hear voices, laughter, and conversation commingled. A tall, thin servant relieved him of his hat, coat, and umbrella, and he found himself face to face with Jill Trumbull, who apparently was on the lookout for him. A smooth, curly-haired blonde girl, not too thrillingly pretty, but brisk and smart, in white satin with arms and shoulders bare, and rhinestones banded around her forehead. "No trouble to tell who you are," she said gaily, approaching and giving Clyde her hand. "I'm Jill Trumbull. Miss Finchley hasn't come yet, but I can do the honors just as well, I guess. Come right in where the rest of us are." She led the way into a series of connecting rooms that seemed to join each other at right angles, adding as she went, "You do look an awful lot like Gil Griffiths, don't you?" "Do I?" smiled Clyde simply and courageously, and very much flattered by the comparison. The ceilings were low. Pretty lamps behind painted shades hugged dark walls. Open fires in two connecting rooms cast a rosy glow upon cushioned and comfortable furniture. There were pictures, books, objects of art. "Here, Tracy, you do the announcing, will you?" she called. "My brother Tracy Trumbull, Mr. Griffiths. Mr. Clyde Griffiths, everybody," she added, surveying the company in general, which in turn fixed varying eyes upon him, while Tracy Trumbull took him by the hand. Clyde, suffering from a sense of being studied, nevertheless achieved a warm smile. At the same time he realized that for the moment at least conversation had stopped. "Don't all stop talking on my account," he ventured with a smile, which caused most of those present to conceive of him as at his ease and resourceful. At the same time Tracy added, "I'm not going to do any man-to-man introduction stuff. We'll stand right here and point him out. That's my sister Gertrude over there talking to Scott Nicholson." Clyde noted that a small dark girl dressed in pink, with a pretty and yet saucy and piquant face, nodded to him, and beside her a very de rigueur youth of fine physique and pink complexion nodded jerkily, "How'd you do?" And a few feet from them, near a deep window, stood a tall and yet graceful girl of dark and by no means ravishing features, talking to a broad-shouldered and deep-chested youth of less than her height, who were proclaimed to be Arabella Stark and Frank Harriet. "They're arguing over a recent Cornell-Syracuse football game. Bertrude Taylor and Miss Fant of Utica," he went on, almost too swiftly for Clyde to assemble any mental notes. "Pearlie Haynes and Miss Van de Steele. Well, I guess that's all as yet. Oh, no, here come Grant and Nina Temple." Clyde paused and gazed as a tall and somewhat dandified-looking youth, sharp of face and with murky gray eyes, steered a trim, young, plump girl in fawn gray and with a light chestnut braid of hair laid carefully above her forehead into the middle of the room. "Hello, Jill. Hello, Vanda. Hello, Winnet." In the midst of these greetings on his part, Clyde was presented to these two, neither of whom seemed to pay much attention to him. "Didn't think we'd make it," went on young Cranston, speaking to all at once. "Nina didn't want to come, but I promised Bertine and Jill or I wouldn't have either. We were up at the Bagleys. Guess who's up there, Scott? Van Peterson and Rhoda Hull. They're just over for the day." "You don't say," called Scott Nicholson, a determined and self-centered-looking individual. Clyde was arrested by the very definite sense of social security and ease that seemed to reside in everybody. "Why didn't you bring 'em along? I'd like to see Rhoda again, and Van, too." "Couldn't. They have to go back early, they say. They may stop in later for a minute. Gee, isn't dinner served yet? I expected to sit right down." "These lawyers, don't you know they don't eat often?" commented Frank Harriot, who was a short but broad-chested and smiling youth, very agreeable, very good-looking, and with even white teeth. Clyde liked him. "Well, whether they do or not, we do, or out I go. Did you hear who's being touted for a stroke next year over at Cornell?" This college chatter relating to Cornell and shared by Harriet, Cranston, and others, Clyde could not understand. He'd scarcely heard of the various colleges with which this group was all too familiar. At the same time, he was wise enough to sense the defect and steer clear of any questions or conversations which might relate to them. However, because of this, he at once felt out of it. These people were better informed than he was, had been to colleges. Perhaps he'd better claim that he'd been to some school. In Kansas City he'd heard of the State University of Kansas, not so very far from there, also the University of Missouri, and in Chicago of the University of Chicago. Could he say that he'd been to one of those? That Kansas one, for a little while, anyway? On the instant he proposed to claim it, if asked, and then look up afterwards what, if anything, he was supposed to know about it. What, for instance, he might have studied. He'd heard of mathematics somewhere. Why not that? But these people, as he could see, were too much interested in themselves to pay much attention to him now. He might be a Griffiths and important to some outside, but here not so much, a matter of course, as it were. And because Tracy Trumbull for the moment had turned to say something to Wynette Fant, he felt quite alone, beached and helpless, and with no one to talk to. But just then the small dark girl Gertrude came over to him. "The crowd's a little late in getting together. It always is. If we said 8, they'd come at 8:30 or 9. Isn't that always the way?" "It certainly is," replied Clyde gratefully, endeavoring to appear as brisk and as much at ease as possible. "I'm Gertrude Trumbull," she repeated, "the sister of the good-looking Jill." A cynical and yet amused smile played about her mouth and eyes. This book is continued on cassette number 9, side 1. Please fast forward to the end of this tape.